Warning, this podcast contains scenes of explicit nonsense and lore.
Previously on the Resident Evil podcast.
But if everyone can just imagine how wonderful it would have been to have then suddenly had that announcement and no one knew about it.
I was getting mixed up with the guy that throws stuff at you that covers your face. I thought you mistook that for fire.
It's hard to say with seeing so little, but I have every faith in them with this one. I've got a good feeling about it, to be honest.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's exactly as you said, like the franchise was 9 years old, but if you're thinking about it in those terms, that sequel was 7 years in the making. That's insane.
Exactly. The waitresses at the Biohazard Cafe would dance to the Spice Girls.
Well, there's the takeaway from this podcast.
Resident Evil Podcast.
Hello and welcome to episode 65 of the Resident Evil Podcast, where our assets have just been absorbed by Tricell whilst looking to bring some sanity to the big questions of 2020. When will the new James Bond film come out? I'm Nick, better known as Neptune, king of the Aqua Ring. Let's see who's joining us today. He may be mass-produced now, but we still have the bona fide original. It stars Tyrant.
Hello.
Reports are sketchy, but he was either attacked by a group of his own kind or a tentacle was inserted where it shouldn't have been. It's Romby.
Hi.
He once built spectacular mansions and cruise liners. Now he builds up voice actors' pay packets. It's George Trevor.
I don't pay them. Hi, good evening.
And finally, he's joining us for the main chat. After he begins, he returns and rises like a knight forever, trying to stand up after a day on the lash. Yes, he's back. It's the Batman.
Hello everyone, nice to be back.
Welcome back, John. Welcome back. He'll be joining us a bit later on, as I said, for the main discussion. So coming up on today's podcast, we'll be looking at all the latest Resident Evil news, both gaming and site news. But the big thing we're talking about today, we've teased it for many a podcast. It's the great canon debate of our time. We're going to be looking at the remakes 2 and 3, its lore, its implications, and going forward, where do these two games stand in the overall canonicity of the Resident Evil franchise? It promises to be a deep dive into the lore, so get your snorkels ready. And we will end with another edition of Neptune's Biohazard Quiz. So let's start off with the news. First bit of news, Resident Evil Infinite Darkness is getting its own manga series. Coming out in 2021 and produced by Tokyo Pop, we'll see an adaptation of the upcoming Netflix series. Anyone excited about that?
I am.
Is it a straight adaptation or an actual tie-in like Mahara Desire? And more importantly, Nick, can we look forward to regular updates for the next 7 years?
Infinite Darkness news.
Initially, I was led to believe it was a tie-in, like Mahara Desire, but I think it is actually just an adaptation, so I think it's just going to be a visual representation.
Want to watch Netflix.
If you don't watch Netflix, yeah.
I thought you were going to say, more importantly, is it going to feature bikinis? I'm excited from the point of view that I really love when we get like a supportive comic range or manga. I mean, I think Sean's made the point before that there are some good stuff in the narrative of Heavenly Islands, but the kind of the concept at the beginning was a beauty contest, and a lot of the artwork just really did kind of put me off. Yeah, if it's kind of an adaptation, but certainly if it's using the main cast that we're getting in Infinite Darkness, then yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. And maybe a slightly more sensible adaptation in manga form would be great.
People will know if they've ever heard about the Resident Evil Vendetta novelization. That's probably, the same sort of, equivalent, if you like. That does expand upon a few scenes, so people who were concerned about Leon S. Kennedy's actions in Vendetta can be rest assured that I don't think he killed anyone on his highway chase scene. And equally, when the rail cannon went off, all those skyscrapers had been successfully evacuated beforehand. These are the type of details which are in the novelization that don't appear in the film. So we could get instances like that, whereby we get expanded scenes scenes to certainly add to the canon. So there's a real good opportunity here. Wouldn't it be good if it was that coordinated that you get the episode on Netflix and then the single release then comes out, I don't know, a week later or something like that, and then you can kind of always follow it, so visually on Netflix and then visually in the manga. Another bit of news that sadly has happened mid-recording almost is the fact that very recently Capcom have sadly been hacked by some awful organisation from the dark web. And as a result, lots of information regarding Capcom's IPs, products and future releases has now been sprawled across the internet. To make things worse, Capcom employees' personal details, names, addresses, telephone numbers, etc., email addresses, they too have also been leaked, and I think it's up to 1 terabyte of information has been stolen. Only, I think, about 10 gig has been released so far, but sadly a lot of it has been Resident Evil related stuff, and that has spread like wildfire. We at the podcast don't like spoilers at the best of times, but when leaks of this information has been procured in an illegal manner, it really does make the situation significantly worse than second-hand information being passed down from games testers. Rest assured, we will not share anything that has originated from the leaks on our social media outlets or in our Discord. We are very strongly against such sharing of information, and especially in this case because it almost legitimizes the criminal and illegal activity that this group have partaken in. The flip side, if you like, is that Capcom didn't pay the money. This was a ransomware attack and they held firm and didn't pay, which was a good thing, even though it has resulted in this information coming out. We as a community cannot share the information so that it doesn't have the effect that the criminals wanted. So rest assured, you can be safe in our little circle going forward, and we won't share that information.
I won't name the website by name on here because I don't want to give them any kind of publicity or anything like that, but a number of gaming websites have shared the information with regards to the leak, including game titles on the front pages of their websites. So if anyone actually wanted to avoid this information, it's too late for that. You literally just click the front page of a site you go to regularly and you go, oh, right, okay, those games are coming then. Now, that's by the by. In this instance, this particular leak, the actual games and the titles and the things that are coming aren't the most important thing. The important thing is the personal information of the employees and people involved with Capcom, their personal details being released. That's the main issue here. And I just found it absolutely disgusting that gaming websites are using this information to basically create a story or an article where they can generate revenue through clicks and things like that when it's affected so many people in a very personal way. That was all I said. A couple of very strongly worded tweets that I had a really, really good response from. And aside from literally 3 or 4 individuals who sent me some abuse, which you have to get used to on Twitter, the response has been very, very heartwarming from the community, actually, with a lot of people feeling a real sense of empathy toward Capcom, which I'm really pleased to see. But just very disappointed, extremely disappointed by some of these gaming websites who should be working together to suppress this thing from happening again. And like you just said, Nick, it's almost giving it validation now. And I think that's the real danger, that we may see something like this again, and these gaming websites are just going to rush toward it, get their articles up. We see it on YouTubers all the time with leaks. The thumbnail of their video is one thing when it's the PSN store uploading the cover shot of the Resident Evil 3 remake. That's just an unfortunate gaffe that happens. But when you're talking about people's personal data, just come on, just the internet just be better. And from what we possibly do understand, it's the community that's potentially affected as well, because did I see something today that there's a potential leak within the ambassadors, as in like all our personal details as well was potentially within this leak. We've all got accounts, we've all got passwords. Could be us as well.
I only concur, because it's the same stance I take on all of these leaks. It's just like putting them front and center in the public causes these sorts of issues. But when Sean's correctly pointed out, when it's something that's like been leaked through unfortunate means, and even if it's one of these leaks where it comes from internal playtesters talking about stuff they shouldn't, it's much, much more different. And the focus in the story should be about why this is bad and not why this is essentially good, because they're taking this information and using it as said to promote their news on their website. Some sites have done it the right way. They've talked very minimally about the content. They've talked about the fact that this was a ransomware attack. This has an impact. And also, the idea that if this goes the positive way for the people that are doing this, they'll just look for more targets. Even if it's not money that they get, it's notoriety. And it's an unfortunate outcome, and it's not a great one. So I do agree. And I thought your tweets, Sean, were very appropriate.
Next bit of news comes from Resident Evil Village and tennis champion Naomi Osaka. People may have spotted recently on YouTube, Sony released a new gameplay clip, if you like, featuring, as I said, tennis champion Naomi Osaka. I think she's won the US Open. My tennis knowledge is not up to scratch, I'm afraid. But she plays a bit of Resident Evil Village, and we get to not only see her reaction, which is always interesting, we actually get to see some of these clips, and we can see the game actually being played for once, which was quite nice. I thought it was quite an effective stance. She was very cautious and very concerned.
She was actually aware of the franchise before she started. Like, she mentions that she knows the game. She just never played them, so...
And of course it's going to, as we know, Village is going to be quite a big release in the next gen, so they obviously want, they're going to start targeting perhaps people that have never played a horror game before, or this is going to be the first big horror game, maybe of this generation. So what did everyone think of the actual gameplay that they saw?
It looks like Resident Evil 7, which is a good thing in my book. It's Resident Evil 7 in a new environment, without VR. Thanks, Sony.
Is that confirmed, though?
Well, they would have mentioned it by now. The thing that I took away the most, because obviously the gameplay snippets are so brief, but a lot in gaming media at the moment is making a big deal of this haptic feedback from the DualSense, and she describes it quite effectively, actually, at moments in that. So, like, there's a moment where she slides off a roof as Ethan, and, like, apparently, like, you could feel the texture of, like, the tiles or something through the controller, and I've seen quite a few videos where people describe that kind of thing. Like if there's like rain falling, you can actually weirdly feel it through the controller. So it looks like there's a big push in adding these kind of functionalities to Village, and there's like the moment where the old chap with the shotgun shoves Ethan, and you actually see her visibly react with a controller in her hand. I assume it just made like a quite sharp vibration. I think it's all pretty gimmicky, this haptic feedback, but I did say the same thing about VR before I played 7, so I'll remain optimistic that it's actually as effective as people are saying.
As Sean said, it looks just like Resident Evil 7 in a different environment, but there were a few differences that I noted. The return of the Resident Evil 2 yellow taped boxes, which are destructible, should we say, and it looks like explosive barrels make a return as well. You can piece a lot of this together, so if you look back at the Tokyo Game Show reaction video of someone playing it and getting very flustered, it sounded the same sort of demo that they were giving. So I think we are right at the beginning of the game, and I think we can start piecing together some of the opening of the game. Perhaps it starts off with some of the scenes where he's walking in the kind of dark forest in the snow, and then he meets up with the chap with the shotgun, and then all hell breaks loose. That seems to be what happens, and the opening is a big set piece moment.
What I also think is it might be one of those, and no pun intended, cold opens, that it starts you in the village and you're there, and this whole thing will take place at like a flashback part that's going to explain why Ethan's there. Like, you just start in the village.
Oh, okay, that's good. Right,
That's my guess too, because rather than having all the build-up of the narrative and then getting him there, I think it'd be interesting and more engaged. You're already as part of this exploring it, and have that happen, and then fill in the backstory as to why he's there. But I could be wrong. The intro to 7 was very short.
George, what are your thoughts about the video? I know you've been vocal before about, the benefits of 7 kind of being a return to survival horror. Are you concerned more so or less so now about whether they're going down an actionary route, considering what Capcom have said?
I feel I'm a bit restricted in what I can say too much, because, to be honest with you, I've actively avoided certain things because I really don't want to be spoilt too much at all. And I didn't get a lot of detail from the Tennis Stars gameplay, but very much kind of what sort of coming from the direction of Stars, that the elements, the aesthetic and the feeling and the atmosphere that kind of gives me throwback to RE7 is making me enthusiastic for the production, definitely. I feel like this is going to be, stating the obvious, but it's going to be the biggest Resident Evil game to date in terms of, I think, exploration. And I'm still really intrigued. I don't know if I'm reading too much into it, but this comment during the developers interview saying that they're taking a more real life sort of look at some of the puzzles and giving the player more of a kind of almost like an open perspective to come at the puzzles in different ways. So maybe there may be more than one different way to progress. That definitely piqued my interest.
The other thing we can take from the release of DMC5 Special Edition is because it's running on the same engine and it's performing quite well. Like, its scalability is pretty, and some of the stuff that they've managed to do on both the new platforms. So that bodes well for the new engine.
Next bit of news, Laced Records are back with a new vinyl collection. Oh yes, sliding into action is the original soundtrack for Resident Evil 6. Coming in March 2021, the limited edition features a Coke bottle green colour discs, which is always nice, and that's coming at £33 for your pre-order UK pricing. Sean, you are a Resident Evil 6 champion. Is this something that you'll be interested? I'll be honest, Sean, I can't remember anything from Resident Evil 6 soundtrack that sticks in my mind, so illuminate it.
I've gone a bit quiet because I was trying to think myself.
I can't think of a single track, so please.
I won't be getting the vinyl because I don't have any. I'm not a collector in that kind of sense. The artworks and stuff like that are neat. In terms of music in Resident Evil 6, it's one of the more unremarkable ones where the tracks that people like the most, they tend to be the throwback tracks, like, the reuse of Ada's theme from Resident Evil 2 and things like that. But I mean, it's a functional soundtrack. I don't recall any aspect of it being bad.
I think that's the thing. You have a soundtrack that exists. If people don't comment on it, it's still not a bad thing. It's
certainly not as genre defining for the series as like RE5s or Outbreaks or anything like that.
I'm a bit of a collector's edition snob, and I wanted to get the collector's editions of all of these. I've got Zero and Code Veronica. There's some lovely art with the Code Veronica one, but they seem to go so quickly. They do release these in quite limited edition Lace Records, don't they? Because if you're not on their website quite quickly to pre-order those collector's editions, they go very quickly.
Yeah, that's how I missed out on 3 and 4.
This is the thing, right? We all generally like 7, but I wouldn't rush to get a soundtrack for 7 because it's supposed to be quite a minimalistic one. I know it's got some good tunes in it, but it's minimalistic. 6 is just a huge game, so there's obviously lots of songs that tracks that they can put on it. I'm surprised they not gone down the Outbreak route already, because everyone knows the Outbreak tune. It's the all-time classic, and there's some other good tracks as well on the Outbreak soundtrack.
Most of it's fantastic, the Outbreak music.
I think the next theme is my favourite. I think that's.
I think they're sticking, barring Code Veronica, to the number titles. They're slowly going to run out of vinyl releases at this rate. So I think Outbreak makes a combo set of File 1 and 2. Basically, they've done all the others.
I think you'll likely see the Revelations games first.
Yeah, they're considered mainline, so I can see them coming.
Two's got a huge. Yeah, I've got the soundtrack for 2. It's huge.
Have you got your pre-order in, Nick, for the Gaiden vinyl?
God, could you imagine? Final bit of news, the live-action Resident Evil movies are back. Oh yes. Like the T-virus itself, it just keeps on coming and bringing the corpse back from the dead. But there we go. But this time, we have hope. This is not involving Paul W. Anderson. It is the movies minus Miller. The cast was announced and is as follows. Excuse my pronunciation. Kaya... Oh, Jesus Christ. Scott Delario is playing Claire Redfield. Hannah John Kamen is playing Jill Valentine. Robbie Amell is playing Chris Redfield. Tom Hopper is playing Wesker. Avon Horgia, I assume, is playing Leon. And Neil McDonough. Is it just Donna?
Yeah.
Yes. They're not exactly Japanese names. Come on.
I know. I am really bad at that.
They've all got one thing in common, though. Do you know what they've all got in common? All these actors.
Go on.
They've all received nagging emails from me to come on the Internet podcast now.
He's playing William Birkin for anyone there. Yeah, so this was announced with quite a lot of fanfare, actually, these big names. And there's been a few more that have been added to the roster since, but these are the big names that have cropped up. So I think they've done a fabulous job. The cast look pretty good.
My favourite cast member is the graffiti, though.
You haven't even seen it.
I could
just heard about it because we told of you before.
Yeah, I'm so excited.
Well, we'll talk about the graffiti in a minute. But in terms of the casting, what's everyone's thoughts, Sean?
For the most part, they're great. I mean, I've been a big fan of Hannah for a long time, from sort of the Black Mirror days, and so it'll be going to be quite interesting to see her playing Jill. Kaya's a really good match for Claire, I think. I'm not familiar with. Is it Robbie Amell? It's Stephen Amell's brother, isn't it? Yeah, I'm not familiar with any. I don't think I've seen anything he's been in. Neil McDonough, I see more of probably a Wesker in him than Birkin, to be honest.
They're certainly going for an older Birkin, aren't they? In this, he seems to be notably older, more like late 40s, I think.
I think we'll just have to wait and see, because there's still. I mean, I know there's been an abundance of set photos, which I know you're going to mention again in a minute, but it's still extremely early days for this. I know the actor who plays Leon, Avon Ugia, has done, and I think it was an Instagram video of him actually in uniform as Leon.
Yes, he has.
Check that out. So, although his uniform isn't like a one-to-one match, it's still arguably closer than a lot of Anderson's designs. And I think just from, again, what we've seen in some of the set photos and certain key pieces of authenticity, irrespective of like story choices, and you know it's not going to be a direct adaptation. It probably won't even be considered canon. But in terms of like referencing images, they're already doing a better job than just simply inserting the Galaxy train from RE2.
To me, that thing adds to the potential that the script might be remixed. At least the people that wrote it probably also paid attention, because if the production design is the visuals, and obviously that ties into what is needed from the script, then I would have some hope that the script is done with some sort of, at least, may not be one-to-one understanding. We're not going to see a perfect adaptation, but at least with some reference to who these types of characters are, and the background
I think
be a bit more true than we've seen in the past.
Well, I was just going to say, Rob, I think we can say with almost 100% confidence that there's going to be a bit more of an appetite for this than a Jade and Billy Wesker Netflix series.
Probably true.
Don't know. Got my flags ready to go. Billy, Jade, Wesker.
Just briefly touching upon that though, because I don't want to derail this too much. How can two things like this simultaneously exist at the same time? It's just I know Constantine Films still have the rights, and they're the ones that are doing. In fact, no, they're doing both, aren't they? They're
doing both, yeah.
Someone up there in the high towers of Constantine Films has actually like simultaneously greenlit these productions. And you know there's going to be people out there that, I mean, maybe they will correlate in a weird way, I don't know, but people are going to be asking that now. And you do have the danger with, like, Infinite Darkness coming out as well, around the same year. There's going to be all sorts of people who aren't up to their lore, aren't quite as sort of dialed into the community as, like, we are. It's going to be completely, like, mind-blown in terms of, like, what fits, what doesn't fit, what's canon, what's not canon. There is a real danger you can oversaturate the brand, as we've seen in previous years, where they've just kind of thrown, like, 2012 was a good example where they just threw so much into that year and the quality dropped dramatically, and I really don't want that to happen again. And there's just always a danger when they go, they're clearly riding the success of like 7 and Remake 2 and just going, just give everybody more Resident Evil, more Resident Evil, and I worry.
The difference here, I guess, is it's not all Capcom themselves. Like when you talk back at 2012, it was, with the exception of one movie, it was all internally Capcom's titles, so the quality did dip. But here, the issue is the inconsistency potential of quality, plus what you were getting at, which is like, obviously Infinite Darkness exists within the game canon, and the movie and TV series on Netflix will probably exist within, maybe connected or completely separate.
I've already seen an article somewhere going, should Resident Evil have its own cinematic universe? So, the questions are being raised, but it's the point that Sean just made. People will be going, okay, I've got the new movie coming out. I've now got Netflix, and you connect the dots, isn't it? Because Marvel have set such a good precedent. Star Wars is following suit as well.
You've sort of described one of the reasons, Nick, why I champion Dead Aim above a lot of the series, because I know everybody refers to like Bruce and Fongling as budget Leon and Ada, but the point was it was still a reasonably effective story that didn't really need any ties, bar a couple of file references and whatnot, but it is totally standalone, and I do kind of wish we had more Resident Evil titles that were a bit standalone like that, because it helps to expand the world and make it feel bigger.
Just in terms of the set photos, we can have a quick chat. I mean, the set photos are everywhere. People who know us in the community, we don't do spoilers. We want to keep people as spoiler-free as possible, and we apply that to our Discord and generally on our social media accounts. We're not in the habit of re-promoting some of the set photos. At the moment, they're not story spoilers, and I think it's near impossible for anyone to avoid these photographs. They are literally everywhere. Unlike perhaps like leaks of Resident Evil Village or something like that, you can make efforts to avoid.
Not to bury the lead, but I think it's because of the content of this spreading so much more rapidly. Obviously, the people that are in the filming location, they're taking photos. There are plenty of times where films film in a particular location, and people will take photos of them, see them in public spaces, but you wouldn't see this much normal particular film filming thing. You might see like, oh, there was a scene of someone doing stunt or whatever, But the fact that we're constantly getting new versions of photos and updates and different ones and construction of this and sign this and this shop front and this restaurant and this, it's just like clearly, there's a lot going on and a lot of Resident Evil fans in the area and a lot of people online who want to see more of it, so they're just going out.
Moving on from this point, and we've sort of agreed, haven't we, that we're going to actually make a conscious decision not to circulate any photos on the Discord now.
I think we're getting to a point where it looks like the sets are nearly done, and we're soon going to start seeing people utilising said sets, should we say, and that's when I think this kind of storyline spoilers will start appearing, because if you can place someone there, you could then, start putting X and Y together. So, when humans start populating the sets, I think that's where we'll probably draw the line.
I think that'd be pretty wise, because I remember when some early Avengers Endgame set photos leaked, it showed Ant-Man in the Battle of New York, which implied the time travel element like 4 years ago, long before the movie came out, and that did kind of spoil it a little bit, just through the simple case of like an actor not necessarily being in a place you might expect them in costume can inadvertent way lead to a spoiler. So I do definitely think we ought to tread carefully moving forward now.
Yeah,
because if say for example the actress who we've seen doing the videos of like Lisa Trevor is on the RPD set, for example, would in a sense be a story spoiler. I've not seen anything like that, just as a disclaimer. I'm just saying, if you were to see that actress in costume and character at the gates of the RPD, then that's a massive story spoiler, isn't it? So
it means when you go to see that movie, you'd be expecting her to turn up when they get to a sequence at the RPD. You're going, exactly. She's equivalently like the boss fight, something dramatic, just something dramatic happens, like they're fighting off some zombies and there was a screechy noise and she turned up. Well, you would know that in advance because you'd seen her photos. As soon as you hear that noise, you're like, oh well, Trevor, just tell from the noise.
George, I think before we started recording, you've been a bit up and down with
it, aren't you?
A bit up and down with these set photos. Do you think that there's an element of them being intentionally leaked to generate hype?
Oh, I think absolutely, yeah. I think it'd be almost disingenuous for the producers to suggest there's fans that have kind of sneaked up on set and, using these long range. I mean, that's the kind of Walking Dead fans.
I'm going to argue against this. Is exactly what happened. We were working on the film, but it wasn't the company marketing. It was just people on the film, to the point where it got so ridiculous. They were leaking photos and stuff of the sets and so forth, some of the stuff on the thing, that a memo went out internally telling them to stop leaking stuff on the internet. So the people leaked the memo on the internet.
Nice. I didn't want to get too overexcited about all these things, but then, when Romby mentioned to me that This Too Shall Pass was seen on set, I was like squidding like a very excitable.
Do you want to explain to listeners who aren't sure what you're mentioning?
You see this kind of, it's an Old Testament actually reference, but you see this slogan, This Too Shall Pass, on various parts. There's one, I think, above the door frame when you go into, I think, is it Bar Jack, where Jill finds Brad in?
One in the basketball court in Resident Evil.
Yes.
I think that's the first one that's behind Kendo's gun shop.
Lots of the things in RE2 and RE3 and those old pre-rendered backdrops, it kind of gives quite a almost sort of sinister, almost like intense and foreboding atmosphere. Just one of the many things that you get in the environment. You made a good point, Neptune, that, you could take static shots particularly from the second Paul Anderson film, aspects of the RPD, Sienna Guillory's outfit as Jill Valentine, and it could get us equally excited. So holding back, I think, on the fact that, parallel references to the games is going to equate to a quality narrative.
We'll now quickly move on to site news. Firstly, we'd also like to thank our brand new Patreons, Kane Harvey, Super Doman, and John O'Hara. We thank you so much for your support and continue to be humbled by all our patrons that continue to support the podcast to this day. If you are interested in becoming a supporter of the podcast, head over to our Patreon page where you can view all the benefits that you get for helping us out. It really does keep the podcast on Podbean going, as well as our main website page, ResidentEvilPodcast.com. First bit of news relates very nicely to today's discussion is our big canon discussion video, which is now available on our YouTube page. I would like to personally extend a huge thanks to Mr. Robbie McGregor, who is on the podcast today, who did a superb job of the editing. This video has been long in the making. It was something that I thought about doing post-release of Resident Evil 3 remake, and wanted to bring together some of the, I'll say opposing, but the differing views that's going around in the community about where these remakes sit, in terms of the canon, and obviously we're going to be talking about that much later today. I would strongly urge have a watch of it, because it does serve as a bit of a nice introduction to the podcast as well, and it visualises some of the differences and the existing canon status of a lot of the games, the original Resident Evil 2, and more importantly, the original Resident Evil 1 and its subsequent remake, and how that remake is different from the Resident Evil 2 and 3 remake. It's quite interesting. It was fun to write, and again, kudos to Rob for the edit, because it's a fantastic edit.
It was nice just to grab, I had to look into some of the information coming out, and obviously reference some of the quotes regarding the canon, but I did some extra research and found some extra other ones. Obviously wanted to look into that thing, and I tried my best to try and match as much as I can where it can match, or oppositely counters each other, huge differences.
I was watching the video again for the second time today, but in more detail, and I was really impressed. I loved the way the video was cut. I really liked the way that you transitioned the original Spencer Mansion hallway into the remake version. You did that a couple of times, also with the Plant 42. Also, I really liked, actually, it was quite interesting to see when you see immediately at the same time the different scenarios involving Ada Wong and Annette Birkin that you get whether you play Leon A, Claire B. I like the way you had them both on screen at the same time, so you could see the different corresponding scenarios for both those characters. So yeah, that was good. I like that.
It's one of those things when Nick and this is no slight, listening to it, Nick's explaining trying to think of ways that visually you explain this, that's something that's missing from the remake too. And that's the best way I could kind of just demonstrate, is that you have characters in different places meeting different people, just on a visual storytelling basis that kind of explains a lot more, I think, just when you put a snippet of material. It was really interesting especially when Nick would go through these very rapid questions or scenarios, track stuff down. But it made even me, I've obviously talked to you guys all the time, think about these sorts of canon things, probably not as much as someone like the Batman, but regularly enough when I'm playing the game. But even for me, together kind of solidified some of the things and bad about the remakes as well. I had a bit of fun. And there's a few little things in there that I thought would be funny. Subtitles at one of them, so if you pay attention to what Nick's saying and subtitles at the same time, sometimes it's a bit of a laugh. It's nothing serious. I'm just don't take it as canon gospel for us. There was some really impressive stuff that I just did, being able to transition of the shot of the helicopter from the original CG Resident Evil 3 Nemesis to the remakes version. It just makes such a great comparison image, because it's the same shot. It really is. It's an explosion while a helicopter flies off, and it just shows you the graphic fidelity changes as well. And I think on that level, it's quite cool.
And I think it was really useful to put into this video as well the comments from Capcom themselves and how it's changed and evolved over the past couple of years, from that position where Capcom said Resident Evil 2 is very much a reimagining, and we put those clips in. Obviously, no copyright intended, just for information purposes and so forth. And then how, for reasons we don't know yet, how it's changed into being, all part of the same kind of universe. And then that inevitably leads to the questions that I then pose later in the video. So it's a bit of a history of the canon of Resident Evil, which isn't as fluid as perhaps it could be, but there is a narrative structure throughout the games, and it's all been a bit tipped upside down on its head.
Before we get to the canon podcast, if you haven't watched the video, pause the podcast if you can. If you're not listening to it in the car, pop open the YouTube page and watch the video first, because I think it's going to be a very good visual introduction.
Final bit of news, a bit of streaming news. Myself and Stars Tyrant, we concluded our lore playthrough of Resident Evil Gaiden. Oh yes, part 1 is available on YouTube, where it was streamed on our specific YouTube page, and now part 2 is up as well, and you can sit back and watch that.
The emulation was spot on this time, thank God.
Emulation works, yeah. But that was really good fun, because part 2 of Gaiden is where all the lore really happens. But that does conclude all our site news, so we'll now move on to our main discussion of the podcast, and we welcome back the Batman for it, and we therefore ask the question, what is the deal with canon?
And now we have a rather unfortunate turn of events. It seems that the President and the Federal Council have passed judgment over the civilians of Raccoon City. The President and Federal Council have ruled that the Bacillus Terminate operation is the best course of action for this extreme situation and have since executed. Based on that fact, Raccoon City has been literally wiped off the map. Current reports have the death toll surpassing the 100,000 mark. Our hearts go out to those poor civilians of Raccoon City.
So long, RC.
What's the deal with canon?
Hello, one and all, and welcome to our much anticipated great canon debate of our time. Long-term listeners will remember we dissected the issues of the canon following the release of Resident Evil 2, with Resident Evil 3 well upon us, and the consequences perhaps more muddled than they've ever been before in the history of the series. What better time to have a deep dive into the canon of Resident Evil 3 Remake, the future of the series, and exactly how does this game fit in with the original Resident Evil 3 and the wider Raccoon City incident, should we say. I am delighted to say that we've gained one, lost one, so we welcome back John, aka the Batman, so welcome back, John.
Thank you.
But in order to make room for John, we've had to kick off George Trevor. No, that's not true. George has sadly had to leave us for the rest of the podcast, so his appearance was fleeting, but very much welcomed in the news section, so he'll be back though. Welcome anyway, John. We are pleased you have been able to come back, and your input here is a necessity because you know the existing canon probably better than any of us here, but we all have a good understanding of the Raccoon City incident, as it's probably been our lifeblood for the past 20 odd years. What we want to do is look through, to start off with, Resident Evil 3 Remake. It's been about 5-6 months now since the game hit the shelves, and in terms of overall legacy, it's not quite had the same impact I think Remake 2 has had, and one of the elements I think that has kept some discussion going is how this game fits in with the canon, so to speak. I think when we discussed Resident Evil 3 Remake in the podcast previously, I know for a fact that I said that I felt this game felt more like a remake than a reimagining, simply because of the amount of detail that was contained in the game compared to Remake 2, which seemed very fleeting, very vague. This had very specific time and date incidents. The question is, how can that fit in with what we know from Resident Evil 3, the original game from 1999? I think if we start off with some general comments from each of us, just to see where all our heads at, I suppose, and then we can dig a little deeper. So, Sean, what's your canon stance on Remake 2 and 3?
I don't think this will come as any surprise to anybody, but for me, personally, I don't consider the events of Remake 2 or Remake 3, any aspect of them, whether it be a file or anything like that, any date or time, I don't take any of that into consideration for canon. It's OG2, OG3 for me, and that's it.
Okay, Rob?
I mean, it's similar. It's one of those things, I think the versions that are portrayed in those, reimagined ideas are cool in their own, and they can be their own thing, if you want to take them as they are, but I think keeping them separate is my understanding. It's better to have an OG version and the reimagined versions as their own verse. So that's my thoughts on it. That's what I would like to see happen.
Just from my personal point of view, I've always been, I'll say, flexible with some of the canon. So specifically, people know that I take a bit of an interest in some of the mobile games. So you've got Resident Evil Genesis and Uprising, which are, for all intents and purposes, complete reimaginings of the original Resident Evil game and Resident Evil 2. They bear absolutely no resemblance to the OG games, but they include all the characters in completely the wrong settings and environments. They also include a lot of the original files as well, but they also add a few new files. Probably most famously is George Trevor's anniversary letters and things like that. And I've always said, because those games were made by Capcom, I considered them to be certainly headcanon, but possibly foolproof canon as well, if I can say such a thing. So I've tried to take a similar approach, because I fundamentally can't see much of a difference between Remake 2 and Resident Evil Uprising. They're both made by Capcom, they're both reimaginings of the original game, and they've all got new files. Problem that I've found, and I'm sure Batman will elaborate further, is that if you were to take all the new files, some of them, Raccoon City Jazz Festival, things like that, wonderful. That doesn't interfere in the slightest. Then you are then dealing with questions, and we raised this in the video, which we mentioned a bit earlier on in the podcast, questions like, well, is Wayne Lee canon? Is Dr. Bard canon? canon, and then you're suddenly into a whole world of pain as to whether Nest is canon. Well, if Nest, which is mentioned in the files, is canon, does that mean that Birkin's lab that we see in Resident Evil 2, is that now Nest? And it becomes a lot more problematic than just adding George Trevor's anniversary date, which causes zero problems. So I'm still very much confused and conflicted about it, and I tend to lean towards Sean's point of view. It is easier to ignore it all. I think with recent comments and communication from Capcom, that's becoming harder and harder to do. So, John, what's been your assessment of the remakes? I know you've been looking into them quite extensively for future projects, so I think everyone's going to be quite intrigued just to know, and of course being the author of the timeline, which excluded remake lore, where's your general head at with this?
Well, I agree with all of you, really. I mean, I want to praise Remake 3 in terms of not being afraid to add new lore. You know, it added a lot of new lore, and this is arguably what was disappointing about Remake 2. The files in Remake 2 were very disappointing, and apart from maybe the subplot with the orphanage, it added very little in terms of new story elements, and at the same time seemed to discard a lot of background story elements from the original game, whereas Resident Evil 3 seemed to do the opposite. And, you know, I applaud Capcom for doing that, but question is whether this new lore, you know, is it any good and does it fit? And like you said, Nick, there's plenty of files in there which can slip in superbly with the old lore, yet there's other files which completely contradict things, and, you know, files that even go so far as to render the two Outbreak games as non-canon, if indeed Remake 3 is supposed to take precedence. All that being said, I agree with you guys. I think Remake 2 and 3 should be enjoyed as their own thing, rather than trying to imprint it over the original and force the two together, because it just doesn't work. The only way to make it work is to pick and choose the items you like and discard the ones you don't. And as we've said many, many times previously, that's a very slippery road to go down.
There's always, and this is the kind of counter argument that you do see, there's always been a bit of picking and choosing with regards to the canon, such as the incident at the mansion, you know, who does what. You do have to kind of pick and choose to an extent as to the events, who sets off the self-destruct, where does Richard die, and things like that. But there is that fundamental difference, I think, with... And let's be honest, we're not just talking about Remake 3, because Remake 2 has that exact same issue. Although our video was called Is Dr. Bard Canon? It originally was Is Wayne Lee Canon? It's exactly the same principle, you know. Everything about Remake 2's laboratory and Nest completely contradicts geographical location, point of access, everything to the OG Resident Evil 2. So we're not focusing exclusively here on Remake 3, but certainly Remake 2, even though overall it's less iffy, should we say, than Remake 3. But there is that element of picking and choosing to an extent, but it's always been within the same game, if you know what I mean. So you could always see from the other point of view and kind of mix that up, but within the same canon context. It's then very difficult, I think, to then mix up completely different games. The fundamental question, is Birkin's lab Nest 2? It's either a yes or a no. Is Birkin's lab on the outskirts of Raccoon City under the marshalling yard, or is it under the sewers, basically in the city centre? Or is there two? And then we're entering a whole world of...
It feels like Capcom just want to summarise the events of 2 or 3, and you know, you guys have done this more than probably I have on the Discord and previous episodes, where, you know, the story is Leon and Claire go to Raccoon City, they encounter a number of things, and then they leave the city. You know, that it's literally wanted to be that vague. You know, Jill, on the 1st of October, Jill battles the Nemesis in an undisclosed location, and firing a railgun kills it and leaves. And I hate that when it's so detailed and so well done in the original games, to now have to incorporate that kind of mentality, that real vague nature. One of the worst arguments I think I've heard from people with regards to the original games is the fact that people have described them as being loose canon, in inverted commas. And I hate that, because although there are, and it is well known, there is no sort of clear canon path depicted in 1, 2, and to some extent 3, with the live selections and whatnot, I still debate the loose canon argument because of the files specifically having dates that are accurate down to sometimes even like the time of day. So things are locked in there. And when you have glaring contradictions like the nurse's diaries and files in Remake 3, which don't correlate to the timeline of the original games at all, that's not loose canon, because those dates are locked in, if you know what I mean. You know, just because you have to interpret your own path through the playable aspects of the game doesn't mean the canon's loose to an extent. if that makes any sense.
It just becomes that more problematic as to exactly which is the true path. And my bigger concern is perhaps not the games themselves, it's almost the future content. I don't think if, for example, Resident Evil Village does a flashback or something like that, it's very unlikely that we're going to have something very Remake 3 or Remake 2 new lore specific. Or even Infinite Darkness, for example. If they show Claire and Leon in the lab or something like that, even if it is Nest 2 lab, you could almost brush that aside. My concern will be if the next time they do Resident Evil Village and there's the Biohazard 8 Keita Shinso book or a new Archives 3, where they do get down to the nitty-gritty, then how will that be depicted? Will it be written as if it's OG Resident Evil 2, but the correlating pictures will be Remake?
It'll be like Wesker's Report all over again.
It'll be a bit like Wesker's Report, which didn't quite work. You know, some of the pictures didn't quite match up at times, but, you know.
When I streamed it previously, Remake 3, there was people asking the question in chat, and it's a really good thing. What is the purpose of Dr. Bard, and what is the purpose of the vaccine storyline? Why change it? You know, why make these additions? What is the actual goal at the end of the day to put in effort rewriting that aspect of like how the vaccine worked, Dr. Bard's role within the game?
And the end scene as well, one would say.
Yeah. Why change Nikolai's sort of backstory, you know, to having him working against Umbrella? And then obviously this is leading into, you know, the rumours of Remake 4. Are they going to go in a dramatically different direction with that game and use some of the elements they've introduced in Remake 3 that stand out against the original game? But it baffles me why they changed so much of it.
I think the thing that answers this question is the clip that Nick and I used for the video, which is the roundtable discussion where the developers are talking about the idea that they don't want to just make the same game again. They say that exists and they want to do something different. And I think that's really what this boils down to. If they're able to separate the idea that they want to make something different, there needs to be a line in the sand too as to what that means moving forward. And it's things like the anniversary artwork that kind of does make me slightly concerned, because you guys are talking about, you know, an archive scenario or, you know, recap where they're using OG storyline stuff and showing visuals. Well, they probably are going to show the visuals of the new stuff because it's flashy and it looks cool, and it's, you know, the characters look very, you know, they're obviously who they are, but they're new versions, and that they're probably going to stick with those visuals. And I think this is the problem. We are going to get continual mixed messages across the board through this stuff if they don't make a stance one way or the other. Well, the other part I wanted to bring up, and I mean, maybe this comes back to that whole thing I've talked about in the past about alienating part of the fan base, right? If you make a statement about how like only one of these is the true canon or is the proper existence, there might be people you're alienating. So there might be people who are like huge fans of the new remakes or reimaginings, and if they get told, well, they don't actually properly exist, they're just games, they're not really story canon, they might get annoyed. And of course, people like us who really like the OG stuff, if they say, you know, it's actually just the reimaginings from now on, guys, all that stuff's, you know, it's like Legends to Star Wars, so yeah, moving forward we're taking that. Obviously that's not going to help our situation. So there's this whole idea that one group is not going to be happy. You can't please everyone here.
I agree with what Sean's saying in terms of unnecessary changes, but some of the additions are really good. Like, I don't really get the hate for Dr. Bard. I thought he was a really, really good addition because all we got in terms of the vaccine in the original game was one file saying it had been created by Douglas Rover from Umbrella's Medical, and you just had the instructions on how to make it in the hospital basement. But in Remake 3, it really, really expands on that. You know, you've got this character who's associating with the likes of Chief Irons and the mayor. You know, he's got ties in the US government. I think there's a file in the game saying he's wanting to use the vaccine as leverage to try and get evacuated out of the city because he feels Umbrella's going to kill him because Umbrella's killing all the researchers. And when, you know, the government doesn't rescue him, he tries to go through STARS. He doesn't want to go through the UBCS because they know they'll hand him over to Umbrella. I thought all that was really, really good. And it made the journey to get the vaccine important. And I think Capcom consider it an important plot point as well, with the little smashed vial of vaccine that you see in the epilogue that Jill walks past. I like that sort of thing. I thought that was really good, and that's what I wanted to see from these remakes. But what disappointed me, and when I do agree with Sean, is the unnecessary changes, like the changes to the hunters. You know, why have the gammas be developed before the alphas are even sent to the Arkley Mansion? mansion, and we all know subsequent Hunter models were developed based on combat data from the mansion, and now we have the Hunter betas and the Gammas running around before the mansion incident even happens. Stuff like that is just stupid, and that's what's really frustrating. Some of the additions are genuinely quite good, but others are just, like you say, utterly pointless.
I think that's what's been the frustrating irony about these two projects, was that obviously with the aforementioned loose canon with the in-game events, I think what fans would have really liked to see is, and I'm not speaking for every fan, but I think, if you were going to have a remake, people would have really enjoyed to see the actual canon path through that story. I remember one of the criticisms that the 2002 remake had and continues to have to this day is the fact that there is no actual canon ending within that game.
It stayed the same as the original, yeah. It stayed with multiple endings, yeah.
And I think that's what people were perhaps looking for a little bit from these remakes, is like a clear definitive on like what happens to Nikolai at the end of 3. Is he dead once and for all, or is he alive? And instead of actually giving you that, they've made it arguably more ambiguous and more complicated. And I think that's just really a frustrating and irony about the whole thing, was that they had this clear opportunity. They've had a lot of years to plan this, and they've created a product which asks even more questions than it did before they existed. That's really frustrating from my point of view.
I think a really interesting point was what Alex raised in our last podcast about the culture difference between the West and Japan. And I think he mentioned, didn't he, just about like the boarded up barricades, the doors in RPD and Resident Evil 3 OG. And there are questions raised, mainly from, fans. Well, how were they boarded up? Because they weren't boarded up in Resident Evil 2 and etc. And Alex just mentioned, it just has to be for the story. It's just what it is. You just get on with it. It's seemingly there's a bit of a culture difference, I think, between the West and Japan when it comes to the minutiae of the storyline. So that leads me on to the question, and the problem I'm going to pose now is, if Capcom are adopting that technique, which of course Japanese company, Japanese developers, are we over analysing it? Are we caring too much about the minutiae of the storyline? And should we, as you said earlier, Sean, it's just like Jill's in Raccoon City. She was chased by Nemesis, which looks a bit like this. Brad was killed somehow. You get the gist, you get the idea. That kind of thing. And as a result, the discussion that we're having today, I don't want to say it's pointless, because I think it's really interesting, because most of our audience is from the West. But at the same time, would Capcom go back and say, it doesn't matter, we're never going to address these points in future titles? It's never going to come up. The points you're raising about Dr. Bard or Wayne Lee, or, whether Nest 2 exists, it's just not going to happen. So chill out. Is that what they're kind of suggesting?
I think that was the stance that, obviously it's become quite a running joke within the community now, but it's an important point in the discussion nonetheless, was Peter Fabiano's, when asked by, was it Monique, I think, how does the events of Resident Evil 3 Remake and OG 3 occur within relationship to each other, and his reply was, they both do, which has led to the community creating the rather adorable everything is canon stance. And if that's the case, then, if you're going to be that sort of fleeting with, decisions with regards to the canon, then one of the things that I used against like Operation Raccoon City was the fact that I'm quite a stippler when it comes to the geography. So like, one of the things I loved about Outbreak was when you go to the hospital in Raccoon City, it's the one from Resident Evil 3, with very, very carefully, intricately worked layouts that tie into Resident Evil 3 beautifully. It was really well done. Same for the lab in Resident Evil 2. So when Operation Raccoon City comes out and they give you the hospital and the dead factory, they don't resemble the locations that you've played in previous games at all. So that was one of the reasons that I could throw at it and say, no, that's clearly not canon. With Resident Evil 3, obviously you're seeing massive geographical changes. You're seeing huge changes in Resident Evil 2 with Birkin's lab and whatnot. And if it's all canon, then by that mentality, I have to be fair, have to be totally fair to Operation Raccoon City. What's to stop that now from being canon if the mentality is everything is canon? And the answer is, there's nothing to stop that from being canon now. If the remakes of 2 and 3 are valid into so many people's eyes, then I know there's people in the community who would love for Operation Raccoon City to become canon. And to some people, they see it as a kind of like a loose canon, if you know what I mean.
Your question is, fundamentally, what's the difference
between
Remake 2 and 3 and Operation Raccoon City?
Putting aside all my biases, problems I've got with Operation Raccoon City, I have to be fair if you're including 2 and 3 within that sort of, if you're throwing that into the mix, then you have to sort of say, well, here, and I know there's various things with Operation Raccoon City being developed by a different, Western developer and whatnot, and it was always planned from the start to be non-canon, but then what's to stop it from being now? It's tricky.
I think just touching on the sort of geography and the sort of aesthetics of things, I think it's important as well to distinguish the difference between canon and continuity, because although they're similar, they are distinctly different. Canon, in my eyes, is what happens in the story, the accepted works and narrative that make up the established facts that carry on into future games, whereas continuity is all about consistency. So using a basic example, let's say Sherry being infected by the G virus in the original Resident Evil 2, that is a canonical event because that is directly referenced and ties into what happens in Resident Evil 6. It's an established part of the RE universe, whereas continuity is all about establishing consistency. And this is where me and you, Nick, for example, might have a bit of a difference of opinion, because I think you've hinted before that the change in design of Birkin's lab in Orc, for example, and Remake 2 is one reason why you struggle to accept those offerings as canon. Whereas I think that problem doesn't affect canon because it's about consistency. From a narrative standpoint, the lab is obviously meant to be the same place from Resident Evil 2, and its radical redesign is something that affects consistency and therefore continuity rather than the canon of the storyline.
The only issue I have with that is the fact that it's a location that's visited multiple times in other games, and that's while you're talking about the consistency, it has a continuity knock-on effect where, in regards to canon, where those places are revisited. So, for example, the marshalling area and the labs obviously revisited in several other titles, and they are part of that story beat in regards to how that character gets to that location. So sometimes those things are mutually exclusive. They have a one effect of going both ways.
Yeah, I agree. And I do find the geography discrepancies extremely frustrating and pointless in a lot of occasions, but I really don't see them as being overly relevant to the canon. What makes the likes of Orc non-canon is the events are portrayed differently and directly contradict previously established games, and therefore make the storyline and the events that occur impossible to play out. But the fact that the clock tower of the hospital might look completely unrecognisable from RE3 is irrelevant to me because it's clearly meant to be the same place. Like, it doesn't matter if Nest is the lab from Resident Evil 2. That doesn't affect the story. I mean, look at Chris's face in 7. It looks completely unrecognisable, but that doesn't have a bearing on the story. It's clearly meant to be Chris.
Good point. I mean, the only thing I would say is like Remake 2's lab is not underneath the RPD. And Nest 2 is not the Dead Factory, and it's not the finger, it's the fucking Paracelsus sword. Thank you. That kind of thing.
I will keep my Dead Factory lore.
I guess that is picking and choosing, but some of those do have impact on canon too in regards to file locations, personnel, people who are involved. Obviously, if the sewers change and the type of people, but those are more, I guess, a combination of continuity and canon in regards to which files match and which events took place. But I guess the point is, much as John is saying, that again, and we go back to a little bit of a blanket thing, it doesn't matter who or where, we just know there was a sewer, stuff happened, there was a lab, stuff happened.
You mentioned, John, about like the in-game, the actual storyline beats and whatnot of Operation Raccoon City not being able to correlate. But then we have that with like aspects of, and even you mentioned in the very, very succinctly in the Remake 2 lore cast that we did about how one file change in the operation report has essentially invalidated the canon of like 4 titles. And I think we have that with the Nurse's Diary in Resident Evil 3 Remake, haven't we? That patients are still coming into the hospital long after it's been lost in the original timeline.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so, we have that problem all over again, but in a much more cloudy sort of environment as to whether it's canon or not. And it's just, what a headache. What an unnecessary headache.
Nick made a point before, which I think is worth touching on as well, which is in regards to the importance of moving forwards and how things get referenced. Because if I look at it, if you look at anything that's had flashbacks to things that have happened, like, you're talking about the animated films, for example, you've got that one scene where it's Leon and Claire during the events of Resident Evil 2. The canon doesn't really dictate much on that. It's still them in the events of Resident Evil 2, and pretty much every time something is visually referenced later in the franchise, it's only a touchstone. So again, it doesn't really matter if that's the remake versions of them or if it's not, because it doesn't impact. It's just the fact that it's a reference to the events that happened. But the problem I have is later games that refer to something very specific that's within canon, like when all of a sudden we're playing through Resident Evil 7 and there's a file reference to HCF, and you're just like, whoa, holy crap, I haven't seen that in years. Why did you decide to put that that back in there. That's got to mean something. And all of a sudden, if there's changes to games that, I mean, at this stage it's just Code Veronica, it hasn't been remade. But if they remade it, now if they remake it without any reference to that organization, they'll break the canon, they'll break the continuity. So they have to make sure that it's included should they ever remake that, for example, or expand upon it if they remake other options, or sequels as it will be. These are the things I think Capcom has always played quite loose with this anyway when it comes to referencing. I don't think that's changed. So maybe this is part of why we're being much more nitpicky than perhaps Capcom ever has been.
That's a good point.
The geography is, it really is a bone of contention for me. I accept your points about continuity, and indeed, there's always issues, isn't there? Sean, you mentioned the labs in Outbreak being, faithful. There's a couple of issues. There's issues in Resident Evil 2 and Desperate Times, I think, that don't quite sync up. But I would say I don't think they matter to an extent. They can be brushed aside, as John said, as kind of continuity issues. They are the same place. It's clearly the same place in exactly the same way as the marshalling yard in Zero is the same marshalling yard from Resident Evil 2. It's clearly meant to be the same place, even if the numbers don't quite line up on the sheds. That's a continuity issue.
Continuity errors, yeah.
It's tricky, isn't it, with the canon? And I think the problem has been with Remake 2 and 3 is that it wasn't like this when we got the first remake. And we can quickly touch on the 2002 Resident Evil remake. That was, for all intents and purposes, a shot-for-shot remake with additions. But as I touched in the video as well, they didn't have the problems of Resident Evil 2. And we've spoken about this for years. I think you can go back to some of our really early podcasts when we jokingly mentioned, they'll make Resident Evil 2 remake. Oh, I hope not. That kind of thing. The concern about it was because it impacts on so many other games. Resident Evil 1, at the time, had, the mansion, if you like, had only been visited in the mansion. So they could do whatever they liked. It wouldn't have had any impact on the storyline, provided they have stars come in, encounter hunters, encounter zombies, encounter dogs, get betrayed by Wesker, Barry storyline, Rebecca storyline, blows up. Everyone goes home for a cup of tea. That's all that needed to do, and it wouldn't have mattered about the geography and whatnot. And of course, Umbrella Chronicles followed the remake, and that was all fine. With remaking 2, by the time they thought about it, we already had the original Resident Evil 2. We had Resident Evil 3. We had both Outbreaks with geographical locations. We then had Umbrella Chronicles affecting it as well. We had Zero affecting it as well, and new story points as well from Resident Evil Remake 1. So it was difficult to do if they were going to do, if you want to call it a reimagined remake, i.e. we're going to make everything and still have everything fit. There's always going to be problems unless they did that shot-for-shot remake, which, by the sounds of that roundtable session, they were planning on doing at one point, and then decided, no, we're going to go down the reimagined route.
And maybe Capcom, their thinking is, well, the story is so convoluted, especially Raccoon City, which, as you say, there's multiple titles and storylines spinning off that now. It's really impossible just to dissect that event alone. Maybe Capcom's thinking with these reimaginings was to simplify things. Clearly, with the lore introduced, especially in Remake 3, they've invalidated the events of Outbreak there. The events of Outbreak clearly don't happen in Remake verse.
It could be the opposite too. It could be that they went, well, it's such a big event, it just gives us carte blanche to do whatever we want. Like, they don't mind. They're just like, it's an event, we can change it. The details don't need to be as important. We just want to hit those beats.
But the interesting thing is, whereas the events of both Outbreak games might be contradicted and therefore rendered invalid in Remake verse, they still go out their way to ram the point home that the characters and locations of Outbreak, they're still very much there. They exist in that universe. We've got references to Rita Phillips, we've got references to things like Umbrella Noodles and the Kite Brothers Railway, so they're not ignoring Outbreak. They're sort of saying, yeah, these characters existed, the places where the Outbreak events happened existed, but maybe the events themselves just haven't existed. That's one way of thinking you could carry into every non-canonical entry in the series. Wolfpack might exist in lore, Daniel Fabron might exist in lore, but that doesn't necessarily mean the events of Operation Raccoon City and Resistance actually happened.
Yeah.
Or happened in the way that they were shown, yeah.
You do have to wonder whether they've used this remake opportunity to streamline a lot of the sort of side and spin-off titles, because there's a very, very clear visual reference, I think, in Nest 2 with the Corridor of Tyrants.
It's uncanny. It is actually uncanny.
It's essentially the same that you see on Sheena Island, and it would be very, very easy for Capcom to turn around and say, now, from Remake 3 moving forward, there is no Sheena Island. Tyrants was mass produced at Nest 2.
And that would tie into the orphanage thing as well in Remake 2. There's some alluding to some experimentation going on, which is on a similar page to the stuff teenagers. They've just replaced it with children.
That's true,
and
yeah.
say that could be part of the Tyrant experimentation. This did cross my mind. It's never overtly said, but it could easily be put together in that way if so wanted.
I mean, it's one of those things. I know why they did it, because if someone actually, when they were thinking about what they were going to do, if they got, like, I don't know, say Batman was invited to Capcom to say, we're going to make Remake 2, what needs to be in it? Or what can't we change? I mean, basically, they may as well have just done the Seamless HD project. There is so much in Resident Evil 2 that's specific. So you would go, well, you can't change the RPD layout at all because that will contradict Resident Evil 3 and Outbreak. You can't change Birkin's lab because that will contradict Outbreak. You can't change the marshalling yard. And they're like, well, what can we change? The sewers? Yeah, okay, we can do new sewers. And that really was the only kind of area within the whole game. They could have actually added a bit, you know.
To me, the other irony is the other area they could have changed was the introduction streets thing, and they ended up simplifying it, which is quite funny in the end. They could have changed that around or done a new version of it, but in the end they just made it a very straightforward. But I guess that's it, Nick. And again, it goes back to that developers interview. They even said this. You know, they said there's no point in just doing the same game and putting it out there because it exists, and they decided that was that point that they wanted to do something different. And I think that's it in a nutshell. Both of these games, 2 and 3. I mean, the thing that we're also dealing with is obviously referred to the comments by Fabiano in regards to like it all takes place in regards to both the interview and again he said it on Twitter, but that contradicted their earlier statement around the podcast that they released where they said it didn't overtake the OG versions, that they were the main thing going forward. So we're not even sure where that stance is yet either. And so when it comes to the original game, it's not just that location. There's obviously a team that worked on it you had a director who directed the original game, and it was allowing him to make up for things that he couldn't get into the original game. And it wasn't going to change greatly because essentially it is mostly the kickoff point, if we ignore Zero, is the kickoff point for the franchise. So changing heaps about it was probably a big risk. They wanted new flashy visuals and they wanted to tell a slightly expanded but pretty much the same story. And I think that's what it comes down to. The idea of what was wanted in 2002 is much different than what the team wanted to do in 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 over these 2 remakes.
They did that. Why did they then do the shot for shot in 2002? But as you said, different team, different mentality, different market as well.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not sure tank controls would be welcome nowadays.
Even though obviously the HD versions of the Remake and Zero did well, they knew they would sell better if they made a game with more modern sensibilities, clearly.
This is VRC Chief Nathaniel Bard, September 29, 11 p.m. I am acutely aware that my time's running out. And I hope and pray, by making this recording and bringing the truth to light, that I can restore some small shred of honor to my name. All of Raccoon City's suffering began with the release of a biological weapon known as the T-virus. My employer, the Umbrella Corporation, engineered this virus, and they ordered my team to develop a vaccine, which we did. Now, I keep samples of this vaccine here in my office. The rest of it is stored underground. But those sons of bitches at the board, they want to destroy it. They don't want the world to know what they've done. So they're trying to erase all evidence that the virus ever existed. Now, I'm not a fool. I know they don't want me to...
I'm intrigued about the point that we made about Operation Raccoon City. For a new player, if someone was to get into the Resident Evil series now and pick up a PlayStation 3 or Xbox and whatnot and put in Operation Raccoon City, the only way they would know it's non-canon is if they did a mega internet search and treasure trove of information to find. I think there is one comment from an interview with one of the developers that it's what if. How on earth is a new player expected to know that it doesn't count?
I think the opposite is true, and I think this kind of goes back to Sean's comment about the tyrants in the hallway, right, that look like Survivor. I think from Capcom's perspective, the majority of new Resident Evil fans are not going to play a 1999-2000 PlayStation game with terrible graphics unless they're a hardcore fan. So on that level, the average person is not going to know that this incident existed unless it's properly referred to somewhere else other than just the brief mention in Zero. So I think it's the same thing. Not a lot of people are probably going to play ORC. You can play it on certain Xbox platforms, but unless you've got a PS3 or whatever, and unless they continue to make references to it, I think they're just in their mind, if it just doesn't exist, it doesn't exist. It doesn't, whether or not you can play it or not is not the point. It's kind of much like that same mentality that you're talking about with in regards to how the Japanese perceive stuff. They just go, well, that game exists as its thing, but it doesn't have any bearing. They don't really care if people choose to include that in their own personal canon, I guess. They'll just ignore it if they want to go forward, or include it if they do. Like, it's one of those weird kind of just, that's what it is, I guess.
Is that because Orc is so unique? Because, I mean, you could argue for the same thing. Some of the side projects, like Heavenly Island or Mahara Desire, I mean, they're completely skippable in terms of the main story beats, but they do obviously link in with some of the main story points, but it's very unlikely that the Kodaku project from Heavenly Island, or whatever it's called, is going to be referred to ever again.
It's one of those things where it doesn't harm, if you know about it, it doesn't change or harm the games, but if you don't, as you said, if you don't know about it, it doesn't make any difference either. It's one of those things, like, they could find another way to bring it up if they needed to in a game series. It's going back to that mention of HCF in Resident Evil 7. If you've never played Code Veronica at that point, say you've only started with 7, or you played from 4 onwards, you wouldn't know what that refers to. You just think it's in a file, and you just go, oh, it's a thing. Oh, what's HCF? Okay, cool. You don't question it. And so, yeah, it's kind of one of those hard things. I think in some ways, and everyone can put in their own things, in some ways, us sitting here, we're like the best people to try and, well, not the only best people, but we're some of the best people to try and break this down, but we're also some of the worst people to break this down, because we actually care about the minutiae and all the details, whereas a lot of other people wouldn't. They want the very broad strokes connections. And I think that's what game developers look at. They're looking at the broad strokes. They're not always looking at the details, because if they don't match up exactly, it doesn't break the game. It's not the end of the world.
You asked at the top of the night, Nick, are we overanalyzing these things? And the answer is most certainly yes. People who play Remake 2 and 3 but skip the Outbreaks and Survivors, like Rob said, they're going to get all the way up to Resident Evil 7 and have, a perfect understanding of the story. That's not going to ruin that, their experience of Resident Evil 7. And we might know about extra things like the Kodaku project and stuff, which is nice, but it doesn't necessarily give us a better experience with the likes of Resident Evil 7. The remakes of 2 and 3, they cover all the major story beats, and the minor things, like does Marvin get bitten by Brad, or does he get bitten by a zombie in Desperate Times, that does not matter to Capcom. The important thing is he just gets bitten. Exactly.
But it must matter to you, John, as someone who spent 10 years writing a timeline.
Exactly, and that's the point I was trying to make. When you're trying to cover every single minute event, this is where the problems come in, because you can't have both. You've got to pick one or the other, which is why you need to keep them separate. To the casual player, it doesn't matter, does it, about the minor things like that?
We credited Remake 2 back in the day, didn't we? I recall, for actually being a really good starting point for the series, because it's not referential to any other games. We were all thinking, there's going to be, we're going to get a cameo from Kevin Ryman and things like that. And the game is so vague when it came out that it doesn't even reference the first game really in any particular way. And I think that was a very deliberate thing on Capcom's part, because the lore to newcomers, I think, is a massively intimidating sort of thing, and it's not made easy by various factors for people wanting to deep dive. And I think Remake 2, the approach for it was, let's make this as self-contained as we can, so people can buy this game without the feeling that they're going to get completely, mind blown with all the lore references and things they won't understand if you're a newcomer. Of course, Resident Evil 7 works well because it's essentially a series reset, so it's a fine jumping in point. But with the nature of Resident Evil 2, you can see how if someone was picking it up for the first time because they really like Resident Evil 7, you can just see them being completely blown away by all the things that we would have been looking for, all these character cameos and whatnot. And it wasn't interested in doing that whatsoever. At best, you get, here's a Rita Phillips name drop, and we can be happy with that. I can see why that kind of decision was made, because I bet Remake 2 for a lot of people was a very good starting point for the series, because it carries no baggage, if you like.
I think that's true, though. The video game industry is quite unique, I think, when it comes to storytelling, because every sequel to a game has to feel, to an extent, self-contained. As you said, not to put off a gamer. So, for example, I have not played Uncharted 1 or 2, but I've got Uncharted 3. Do I feel, when I'm playing Uncharted 3, that I'm missing out on huge amounts of lore that I need to know to progress the storyline of Uncharted 3? No, I don't. And
it's more about getting more out of the characters. It's the bits of the story that you missed. I mean, using that as an example, if you hadn't played 2, the character of Chloe, for example, would just appear and you wouldn't know who she is and what relation she has to Drake, other than she's on his side at this point. But you've missed that, for example.
I've missed it. But from a new player, it's just like, okay,
she's a character, yeah, exactly.
You just roll with it. And I think Sean's right. For Remake 2, it is that nice getting in point. And Remake 3 probably does exactly the same thing as well. You don't need to know the ins and outs of Brad. You just need to know that Nemesis is after you. And you can pick up Resident Evil 3's storyline very well, and this has to happen in every game of every sequel. It has to be, to an extent.
The only counter I have to that, though, is, and it's kind of going back to what Sean said about Remake 2, is that it was very odd to me that Remake 2 basically doesn't even really refer to any of the events of the mansion incident, pretty much. There's the very loose file of Chris and a couple of obviously references to the fact that Claire is Chris's sister, and that's literally it. So when you look at it from a perspective, Jill is almost a blank slate when it comes to Remake 3. We know from our experience, we know that she was a member of STARS and survived the mansion incident, but a lot of this is very, very briefly brushed over and can be ignored. It's in her apartment, and if you don't look at all the files and stuff, she's just a character. She's just a blank slate for the character. So for anyone who has never played Remake or even Resident Evil 1, in any form, and then just went and played 3 and didn't really take in the files or didn't know what they were referring to. Jill is just a survivor of Raccoon City. She's just a person that you're going to play as to try and escape the city. And there's a little bit of the lore that is actually missing from that in some respects.
I find Remake 3 tonally all over the place like that, because the intro gets you into Jill's head really well, that the effects of the mansion have really, really messed her up. And obviously, if you do look into the details in the apartment, you can see, and it's really well done. I have to credit the game for this, that she's really suffering, with her mental health, and it's not gone well for her the last couple of months. And then that's literally dropped in a heartbeat the moment the Nemesis breaks the wall down and she just becomes an action hero. All this PTSD the game has implied with her apartment, like you say, Rob, the files you can pick up and miss if you're speed running it and not paying much attention.
If this is one of the first games and they're not really queuing to picking up files, you'd hope that the icons that come up when you're near them would get people's attention the first time they're playing it. But some people might go, oh, it's a piece of paper, and then they read the first one and go, or they just miss it. They don't turn around in the right spot, which has always been the case with the franchise. That's nothing new with the remake or the originals. You can miss files and items easily if you don't know they're there. This is where the remakes, to me, actually do falter more than anything. We can talk about canon and continuity and all that sort of stuff, but realistically, it's just about creating the narrative to understand who even the characters are that you're playing as. As I said, there's very fleeting references into sort of the connection between Claire and Chris compared to, say, maybe the OG version where it was made much more overt. And we know why that was in regards to the storytelling. Claire's character was added to the changed version of Resident Evil 2 when they scrapped 1.5, because the point was the development team didn't have enough connections to the original games. That was the reason why of replacing Elsa with her and making this direct connection to the original title and the characters. It's almost like the remake team has kind of not really thought about this. They've almost forgotten that was one of the tenets of why Resident Evil 2 was Resident Evil 2 in the first place.
The beautiful coincidence of including Elsa's costume is that the character could very easily be Elsa Walker in Remake 2, couldn't she? But the lack of connective tissue with the rest of the series,
it's totally true. Totally true.
We've got things like Infinite Darkness coming up, where Leon and Claire look more like OG Leon and Claire as well. That goes back to John's point about continuity issues, so that hopefully that shouldn't be too jarring for perhaps new fans.
The issue with that, though, is because you've got already established CG film universe where they were made in a time where we only had the OG Resident Evil 2, so the versions have to kind of line up more with that. And that's really the only hope you've got going forward, is that they have to draw more of a through line through other media like that than they have the remake versions. But that doesn't mean that that will stay the case. It could just change. But as I said as well, the references to the games themselves, previous games, usually tend to be slightly fleeting. So like the one that I was talking about before, where you see Leon and Claire during the events of Resident Evil 2, and it's only a scene, and it's only a thing, and it could be anywhere. It doesn't matter. So it could refer to that, or the remake in some ways, costumes aside, it would still be the same thing.
There's
it's a nice moment to chuck in a brief aside. In 2014, the HD remaster came out in Asian markets for PlayStation 3. And on that version of the disc, if you imported it, it was the collector's edition with the George Trevor map. There is a new version that Capcom made of Wesker's report, and they updated all the footage, and a lot of the footage was actually Operation Raccoon City FMVs. Now, it doesn't suddenly validate Operation Raccoon City in any way, but what you will expect that should Capcom make any more future video content, like if they do yet another remastered version of Wesker's report or whatever, or if they do an archives book, they will probably use the art from Remake 2 or 3, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's canon, it just means it's more aesthetically pleasing for whatever it is they're working on. That's all.
Yeah, this is like the 25th anniversary artwork I mentioned earlier, where they're using all the RE engine graphics, because obviously that's relevant to current times where people may recognize those characters more, and also obviously more aesthetically, visually, interesting design choice, or the assets that they have on hand easily to make that sort of imagery. It doesn't overshadow the originals, but I mean, I guess the only complaint we had there was like, it doesn't represent 25 years of the game.
The RE engine years.
Yeah.
In terms of other contradictions, but other issues, if they do like a new Wesker's report or a new archives, I mean, one that sticks out is the change to Nemesis more than anything else, because Birkin is quite faithful to his G mutations, so that will link up. But the Nemesis again is very different, both aesthetically, but also in his mutations. I just wonder,
and even his origins,
and his absolutely his origins as well. I just wonder where they'll go down with that, because the second mutation of the Nemesis is very clear. It's very distinct in the OG. The limiter comes off of the top half, revealing his body and much more of tentacles and whatnot. But most importantly, he's still humanoid standing on two legs. That isn't the case.
Tyrant.
Yeah, he's still a tyrant, absolutely. He hasn't got to blob mode yet.
I think Remake 2 already showed this, where there was variations in Birkin that they changed up the sort of gameplay or what happened, and the same with the tyrant in that as well. I don't think, again, it comes back to a continuity over canon. Does the continuity matter about this? Probably not so much. Because it's at the end of the day, it's a boss fight, and what you're talking about is the difference between continuity of the look of that fight as opposed to the canon of its location, of where that is or what it isn't.
Breaking it down into layman's terms, you just simply say, Nemesis mutates and Jill does battle with him.
It's just it sucks. I can see where you're coming from, Nick, because from an interesting visual storytelling perspective, the circumstances like the dead factory, and you use the taps, and his head falls off, and that has a canon part in regards to like how Nemesis works and operates as a bioweapon, and that's kind of lost.
Well, absorbing the tyrant as well, isn't it?
The OG implies as well that by the point of the Nemesis's head falling off, the parasite then takes over, and it's essentially the Nemesis parasite you fight in the final battle. There's very little of the Nemesis left, whereas that's not made clear at all in Remake 3, and you just assume it's the Nemesis still at the end.
There's no distinction made, and I mean he still keeps his head to the point where Remake Jill's jamming the railgun directly in its mouth. I mean, from a visual perspective, I can see why you would keep that, because that's a more striking image. If you're going to create a railgun, that's a perfect place. Just basically saying up yours, like it's.
Are you saying she gives it the finger?
She gives it the finger. Exactly. From a visual perspective, that makes sense. Of course, you're not going to have the Nemesis head fall off in any of the previous fights, but that doesn't change canon. It just changes the continuity of the fights, but it doesn't break anything going forward.
Sure.
Because exactly as Sean said, Jill fights Nemesis, Jill defeats Nemesis. It doesn't.
I just wonder, because
the parasite is the thing. The parasitic thing is probably the biggest canon change potentially.
And I always mourn the fact that by changing the Dead Factory to Nest 2, we've lost one of the most fascinating subplots in the series, which isn't really at the forefront at all. But it's the Delta team that's dispatched to evacuate Birkin. And then obviously Sergei dispatches the 5 tyrants to stop them. And I think the loss of that is honestly, it sounds ridiculous because it's such a thing that people won't even be aware of unless you do your deep dives. But it's one of my favorite little stories within the canon. And to see it gone I find that one of the most tragic blows the game did, in all honesty.
Yeah, because there's a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff for Resident Evil 3 like that they could have added in if they wanted to.
Well, that was what I was going to ask you, John, is like, from your experience, perspective. Obviously, I mean, I think we all came into this expecting changes in these remakes. We always do. But I mean, yeah, it's how much loss there is when there was actually way more potential to be gained. Do you think that was the case, like throughout both Remake 2 and 3?
Yeah, it was like you said before, Sean. It's strange how Remake 2 was so restricted in that it jettisoned a lot of the lore and became almost, like you say, as a standalone title, whereas Remake 3 seemed to have gone the opposite way and added a lot more stuff in. And you're right, Rob, there was material they could put in there. You know, it goes back to the original writer, Karamura. He had so many ideas that he wanted to implement, and backstory with the US government and stuff, things that tie into Resident Evil 6 that could easily have been put in this game, and they decided not to do it. But it's the pointless changes, going back to the beginning of the night. I think Sean was talking about the pointless changes. Like the Outbreak thing really annoys me, because it comes down to just the games being invalidated by just a couple of dates. You know, that could easily be changed. The tabloid front page describes a zombie attack on the morning of September 25th being the third known incident of its kind to happen that month, when by that point in the prime timeline, the city was already blockaded by the military and martial law was already in place, which means the events of Outbreak and Hellfire have already occurred, and all of a sudden we've gone from an army of zombies marching down the street after an outbreak at Warren Stadium to suddenly having just the third recorded incident of a corpse being found with bite marks in the whole of that month. Alone, that one file completely invalidates Outbreak, and it's backed up with other evidence like what happens to Marvin, etc., and like Sean said about the hospital still functioning on September 29th. But that could have been avoided. All you had to do was change the date on that tabloid front page to it happened on, I don't know, September 18th. Change the hospital diary to September 25th instead of September 29th, and all of a sudden, Outbreak is still in play. And whether that it's an intentional decision to jettison it, simplify the story, or whether it's a sloppy mistake, what I'd really like to find out.
I think maybe it's more that not that they wanted to do it intentionally to break, but I think they're trying to think about why Jill was still in her apartment by the date that she was still there. And if you had this outbreak in martial law, like, you know, a week and a half, almost 2 weeks earlier, it's harder to believe that she would have stayed there, and the communication she was having with Brad and that sort of stuff. I think they've looked at it more from, we have to compress this timeline in order for it to make sense that the outbreak's happening while you're in the city. Because obviously when you go outside, this stuff's exploding, people running around, and not everyone's dead, and they've tried to say that this is the beginning of the outbreak and it happens only slightly before Resident Evil 2. I think they've looked at it from that perspective. I don't think it was maybe intentional to drop the continuity of the past, but they went, it doesn't make sense, we want something that's more visually interesting when you leave this apartment. We want to explain why Jill's been stuck in this apartment, why she's, you know, leaving now rather than leaving a week ago if the outbreak's been going for a week, all that sort of stuff.
I completely agree. I think you're spot on there. That still creates problems with Remake 2, because some of Remake 2's files, even though there have been changes, they have in some files tried to remain faithful to the original game. So even though Remake 3 rams home the point that the outbreak has essentially started the same day as Resident Evil 3, you still have files from Remake 2 saying the police station was attacked on September the 25th and everything's gone to shit and there's only a few survivors left. So there's issues within the two Remake games itself.
Which is absolutely unforgivable, because I know they were worked on by different teams, but there should have been a stronger correlation between the storytelling.
Yeah, well, we've talked about this before, that like the building that burns down in Remake 3, if you look at it in Remake 2, it's not damaged at all. It's an entirely different building, basically. But I mean, and that's it. I think there's a lot of this that was, if they had made that decision very, very early on, like right early near the start when they were like working on, they made the decision of what Remake 2 was going to be, that it was going to be what we got in the end. They went, right, let's just plan Remake 3 in case we make that 2 and just plan that around it and keep that in mind. I think we probably would have seen a much more clearer sense of both canon and continuity just even between those two titles.
Again, I'm really intrigued by why so much new lore was added to Remake 3 and why so many changes were made. But there's mistakes even within this own game. I mean, when I was putting together the scripts for this little timeline project we did, I've noticed things like they changed the timestamps for when certain events occurred in Remake 3. Like in the original game, Jill gets infected just after midnight on September 29th, whereas in Remake 3, she gets infected at about 4:45 in the morning on September 29th. And yet you've got Nikolai's unfinished activity log that says, you know, he's got his times of of things he's doing when he's observing Nemesis, and the times and dates don't correlate with the timestamps of the game. So there's issues there as well. It's quite sloppy.
I haven't even thought about that.
I was just going to literally say the same thing. I haven't deep dived Remake 3 lore because I've only played it through in its entirety twice, but that is absolutely unforgivable.
The file that you come across in the warehouse just before you go into the nest is that he's got those logs on the computer. It doesn't match up with the scene when she gets infected, when he appears in that scene. Like.
Yeah, the timestamp here is when Nemesis kills Mikhail, it's 2:11 a.m. on September 29th. And according to Nikolai's log, he is observing the bioweapon at 0400 hours. Nemesis is attacking Jill with the rocket launcher prior to killing Mikhail, which is before 2:11. According to Nikolai's diary, it's 4 o'clock in the morning. It's a sloppy little.
We'll just put an in canon reason that he's just making false data for his for his boys or something. But yeah, that's a bit of a mess. But that's the other part. I mean, Nick can talk about this, but in the video we talked about the fact that obviously it was so important for them to put these timestamps on everything, as if it needed explaining that it was over multiple days, or to try and connect it to Resident Evil 2, even though that wasn't very dated the same way. It's because Resident Evil 2 you don't do it, but you can clearly tell it takes place over the course of like a night, right? Like that's the obvious part. Whereas 3 obviously had a much longer continuity, but the original kind of managed to explain itself without any of this time and date kind of thing made very overtly, and it's almost like they've maybe play tested it and people didn't understand that this was taken over more than one day or whatever.
Yeah, that was always my lingering question when I was playing. I was like, oh, okay, they're going well out of their way to tell me it's 3 o'clock in the morning or something like that, and I didn't understand why, because I always thought in original Resident Evil 3, Jill's narration was perfectly adequate. September 28th, okay, September 28th, October 1st, okay, whatever it is. That's all they needed. That's all you needed, really.
Even down to the helicopter crash being at midnight. If you look at
the clock, you can see
exactly.
So it was like, well, that was always fine. The original Resident Evil 2 didn't tell you that it took place generally on the 29th, but as Rob said, you can kind of work it out. So I don't quite know why they needed to go so in depth with the dates and times. It doesn't hinder things, although John's pointed out the some of the failings with the files not quite correlating. But for me, it felt like they were really hammering it home as to this is when it happens, and it felt very specific, unlike 2.
One thing I was interested to see Remake 3 address was the sloppiness from the original game, in that Jill gets infected and then suddenly the game just stops and nothing happens for 48 hours, and then all of a sudden Carlos thinks, oh, well, I better try and help her and check out the hospital. I was interested to see how Remake 3 was going to try and fix that and make it seem a bit more natural, but if anything, it's kind of worse. Jill falls unconscious and it just flashes up half a day later. Carlos turns up and rescues.
That's how long it took him to get from the RPD to where she was, because obviously with the stuff decommissioned. That kind of works to me. That I can understand that. Like, he's got to battle his way across a city full of zombies, but then you might as well playable. We might as well had another downtown. You could have had a bit with Carlos leaving the RPD and making his way through the city. It would have made a bit more sense.
In the original game, how they sort of stop the game for 48 hours and then Carlos thinks, oh shit, I better go to the hospital. They've done the opposite here. Carlos actually goes to the hospital at the same time Leon and Claire running around the RPD.
That was exactly what I was about to say.
And according to Nikolai's file here, Jill gets the vaccine at 0400 hours on September 30th.
The timestamp when she awakes in the hospital was like a couple minutes after midnight on October 1st, because that's when the news broadcast, and it comes up with, I put it in the video, it's like 3 or 4 minutes past midnight or something stupid on October 1st.
No, sorry, Rob, I think you're mistaken. I'm sure it says October 2nd on that timestamp.
To me, that actually makes more sense than the original, because it means it took her time for the vaccine to work and for her to wake up and recover. That almost works better than the original. But again, it's still not very well explained. And it is. To me, it's a missed opportunity. You could have had the scene with Carlos making his way from the RPD, Nemesis. Then you go back to Carlos and you're trying to make your way across the city to where Jill is. Like, would have been another potential game.
Well, it was the DLC people want, didn't they? They wanted almost like a park section from RPD Hospital, including the park and Gravedigger. And
it would have made sense, to have another city section and then maybe a park, and then Carlos comes through the back of the clock tower, into where she is. That would be, it would make perfect sense to be able to include some of the missing areas from the original game in a different light. But I mean, budget and time, and it's not required, as John pointed out early on. The clock tower is still the clock tower. It doesn't make any difference whether or not we visit or the place exists. And sure, the park exists in somewhere in this new version. We just don't see it. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's just different.
Tyrell, what the hell happened?
Attention all citizens. The contagion spreading throughout the city has been designated uncontainable. On October 1st, Raccoon City will be completely destroyed in a missile strike. All residents capable of rational thought are urged to evacuate immediately. This is not a test. Attention all citizens.
I mean, that's only a day away. There's still people in the city. You think Uncle Sam gives a shit? Fuck. Here they come. Oh, you sit tight. I got this.
But as we said in the video, I mean, the number of, contradictions, the differences are numerous, and you could spend ages nitpicking with regards to, the death of Brad, death of Marvin, Nest 2, does Jill go there, is she cured in the hospital, is she cured in the altar, and it's just those questions as to whether they're important in the grand scheme of things. Probably not. It just creates a bit of a headache down the line. I just wonder if anyone were to say, oh yeah, I remember Jill was infected, oh yeah, you ask the question, and there's two answers, which doesn't fit that well, I don't think, with it. So we are over-analysing it. There's absolutely no debate about it. I just wonder where it leads, and sadly, it's still nothing's confirmed, but the rumours of Resident Evil 4 Remake, I think it might be a good time to touch upon that. So with Resident Evil 4 Remake, let's take the first positive, is that if they completely remake the village, does that, the village scene, does that mean that Umbrella Corps becomes non-canon?
No, because that's a continuity thing.
No,
well, you joke, Nick, but then is this a good point to touch upon the Parasite changes?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's what I meant by the Parasite changes leading into the kind of Resident Evil 4.
It's also worth saying that this Parasite law change about the Nemesis Parasite is not in the game of Remake 3, is it? It was on a website, I believe.
If they do indeed go ahead with that retcon, that is the basis of Resident Evil 4, and Umbrella had access to the Parasites much earlier than the original game. That, for me, will be enough to confirm definitively that these remakes exist in a separate continuity, their own little bubble.
The research going on, that's the historic Umbrella research, so that has a huge knock-on effect to all the rival companies and that's going on. So
I mean, it depends how they play it, of course, but you have to assume Umbrella had access to a living Las Plagas parasite to be able to create an artificial version for Nemesis. And if that's true, as Rob said, that has a severe knock-on effect on separate ways. Resident Evil 5, the whole business with the rival company, and Wesker and Ada's fallout and how they acquire the parasites, and that has monumental implications on future storylines. And if Capcom do indeed go ahead with this, then that for me definitely confirms that these remakes exist in their own separate bubble and have no place anywhere near the originals at all.
So it could be a bit of a blessing in disguise then if that happens, just to nail that confirmation point going forward. I mean, in terms of the actual remake of 4, a bit like with the original Resident Evil, they do have a bit of free reign as to do what they like, apart from, say, the village. If you want to be a stickler for the canon, with Umbrella Corps coming back to the village, Capcom have absolute free reign to do whatever they like to the geography, the plots and the route that Leon takes.
Again, it's like what we've been talking about, just you have to hit the beats that, match that are important, and everything else done in its own form.
What's important in 4 in the grand scheme of things?
Well, the setup, you have to have kidnapping of the president's daughter, because that's probably got to stay consistent for reason for why he'd be there. I mean, it's not necessary, but I suspect in order to have the playoff, you'd have to have Ada stay consistent in her role. The purpose of her goal might be different, but in order to have the playoff between her and Leon, and obviously, the Plagas has to be involved somehow, so I guess those things have to be the same, but anything else.
I've seen one theory that people have put forward that the remake of 4 will not resemble the OG version of 4 in more or less any way, apart from a couple of key factors, because they'll use the opportunity to give us the fitting Umbrella finale we never got in the original timeline. That'll never happen, I don't think, because of the fact that the original version of RE4 is so beloved. And if it doesn't resemble the product that people played back in the day, then I think there'll be a huge backlash, way more so than 2 and 3, because Resident Evil 4 isn't just played by Resident Evil fans. It's so big
it's so much bigger than the series in many ways in terms of what it did to gaming and whatnot. As much as we don't like to admit it because of its lore stuff, but
Sean, you just twigged a thought in my head, which is probably it in a nutshell. I think the reason why, in a lot of ways, 2 may have been so vague, if you look at it on the surface of what was important, 2 was a big game in its day, and the bits that people remember about 2 are all there. The RPD, William Birkin, the G mutations, those things are the things that people probably think of first, and Mr. X, when it comes to 2. But 3, as far as Capcom's not, it sold better than expected. It's the most profitable game, but it wasn't a well-remembered or beloved title in the same way, like that you're saying like about 4 or even 2, I think gave them more justification for also being able to change a bunch of things and not feeling so bad about it because, like it's not as beloved. So, it's something I haven't twigged until you said that. Like 4, the reason why you wouldn't want to change 4, and huge, you could change things, but you definitely want to keep a lot of the feeling of what was in there because it's such a monumental title. But we've talked about this as well. It's like playing with fire. I think 4 is so it's a dangerous thing to be remaking.
On the other side of that coin, though, you have to factor in Resident Evil Village. This is a game with very similar aesthetics from what we've seen so far to Resident Evil 4. We're going to be fighting infected villagers. There's a castle in there that's going to be a major part of it. Are we going to go from that to then the remake of Resident Evil 4, which features pretty much exactly those things? I would say Resident Evil Village, and what we've seen of it so far, is substantial evidence why Remake 4 could be quite different. You might have the opening village siege, and then it might just go completely off on a tangent. And it might treat the fall of Umbrella in Umbrella's Chronicles the way the Remake 2 and 3 have treated Outbreak. They might reference it, but then sort of ignore it and actually come up with a definitive end for Umbrella. I can see the argument for Remake 4 being massively, massively different.
So the final resting place of Umbrella in the remake timeline will be El Nesto.
You say El Nesto, does it even have to be in Spain anymore?
True, very true.
It could be in France, and our favourite Resistance character might be a mastermind of events in Resident Evil 4. Sorry, had to do it. Sorry, Nick, continue.
The Daniel Fabron statue.
Starts coming over loudspeakers and starts swearing at you.
Just talking about Resident Evil 3 not being as beloved as Resident Evil 2, I think you're absolutely spot on. But, and this is why I raised about the Nemesis as a character was and is the focal point. And out of everything that's been in the remakes, I can see the Nemesis being the thing that gets referenced first.
Yeah, you say that. Obviously, Nemesis was important and he put him that way, but comparatively, like, they dropped his name from the title. Like, for the remake, that was one of the biggest differentiating things sort of right off the bat, was that it wasn't, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis anymore. It was just Resident Evil 3. It's interesting that there's definitely an intent. And I definitely say Nemesis is one of the most iconic bioweapons of the series. But as long as he's still in the game, it didn't make much difference. And Jill was the main character. I think pretty much everything else was open for pretty loose interpretation, which is what we ended up seeing in the end. Changed dates, times, and consistent continuity and canon even within itself. I had a disagreement that they said they've been working on this for a few years, and you play that in game and it doesn't feel like they were working on it for a few years.
No.
I feel like maybe they were working on the whole package with Resistance for maybe that length of time and planning, but the actual development of the game, I think it's 18 months tops.
I don't think there'll be a person that disagrees that the Nemesis is probably one of the most single disappointing aspects of both the remake games. I think he's been grotesquely mishandled in remakes.
Yeah, we've talked about this as well, where Mr. X feels more like the Nemesis in the OG, and the Nemesis is more like Mr. X was in the OG. They've flipped and swapped places.
Heading back to Remake 4 then, yes, there is scope here just because of the freedom, but I think you're both right. I think, John, you're right. There is that opportunity to perhaps correct some of the wrongs, bring in some of the 3.5 elements that were excluded. That could come back. But at the same time, they need to get that feel right. And for all the Cliff Notes version of Resident Evil 2 Remake, it did feel the same, didn't it? The RPD was still wonderful. It felt like the old RPD, just upscaled and looking wonderful. The only thing I always think was a bit off was the labs, but it's hard as well because when we played it, I mean, we're all roughly the same age. Our affiliation towards 4 was coming at it from a much older age than it was with 1, 2, or 3. So we do have our nostalgia goggles on when it comes to perhaps the original trilogy, and less so with 4, 5, 6.
Yeah, I understand what you mean. 4 was such a game changer, but I think, Sean's definitely alluded to it, and I'm sure John's the same too, is that I think we're all well aware of where Resident Evil 4 sits in the general scheme of gaming history. and how big of a title it was. And it's still a fun game. It may not have been the game that we had been used to with the franchise, but by this point in time especially, I think we've seen so many variations. The chameleon that the franchise is to change its shape and form and to whatever's needed or whatever the developers want to do is a testament to the franchise in some respect.
No Resident Evil game has had a bigger impact on the gaming industry and what came after it than Resident Evil 4, I would say. You have to bear in mind that the over-the-shoulder perspective that every other fucking game in existence did not exist until Resident Evil 4, really.
There was only really one game that came out before it that had a similar camera system, and it wasn't as finessed as it was for 4. So that's the reason why 4 became the benchmark.
If you read interviews of Cliffy B from Epic Games, they attribute the Gears of War camera system to Resident Evil 4, and that's really what skyrocketed it into popularity. Talking about RE4 and its eventual remake, I think we're almost certain it's going to happen. If they do drastically change it, there's a question. I've pitched this to you guys so many times on the podcast, but where does it end? I said this before the Resident Evil 2 remake came out, and we've had 3 since then, and now I'm asking the question again. Where does it end? If we get a remake 4 come out, and it's dramatically different, we pretty much assume that the canon's now split completely in half, and on one side we've got Prime, and we've got remake timeline on the other. Do we assume that there's going to be a Resident Evil 5 that comes after that's going to be dramatically different to OG5? What do people actually want? Do people even know what they want anymore? Or are they just along with the ride? And that's what I worry about, is that people just are going to become so bludgeoned by this that they're just going to be like, I actually, no longer care about the lore because it's just this ever-changing thing. And the lore's the one glue that this series has had for 24 years, 25 years that's held it together. It's been the most consistent thing about it is the lore. When all the gameplay things have changed and, the mechanics have changed, the lore's been the one through line that you could rely on as being robust and solid. And if that just gets fragmented, then I just wonder what's left and where do we go?
Well, I've hypothesized before that if you end up with a certain remake-esque timeline, that there might be this idea that eventually the continuity still joins up and you just take and leave which side of the continuity you take. But the more you read games, or the more you add to that, then obviously the less chance that happens. So, if you remake 4, depending on how that went, if it was more straightforward, it may not necessitate any changes to, say, 5, 6, and 7, because those things exist in their universe, and they can just say there's an OG timeline that goes this way to the left, and it matches up to the original version of 4, 5, 6, and then this version goes off on its own tangent, then it comes back in at 5, and if the continuity still is able to be consistently lined up, then it doesn't make a big difference. But there are other times where you could split it into 2 lines. You've got one line that goes left, and that's originals, Code Veronica, Outbreaks, Dead Aim, all those sorts of things right up to 7 and 8, and then another line that goes just the remakes, so 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then anything else. But it does. That's a good question. Where does it end? What will we see next? And does that mean in years we're seeing remakes of 6 and 7 as well? And the problem, I think, we've talked about this before, gosh, I'm going on a rant now, but the same thing about not knowing what the franchise is, sometimes to its strength and sometimes to its detriment. What is popular? How do we move? How do we create new games? Is it easier to go back and revisit old ones and put new ideas in than it is to create all new stories? Have they pigeonholed themselves into was getting rid of Umbrella and getting rid of people like Wesker more detrimental to the franchise story going, and then it's to kind of be able to continue? These are things that we unfortunately have brought up time and time again.
If we find out all these remakes are done just so that they can reverse the volcano scene, if that's the whole point.
God, see, that's the thing. All of a sudden, you remake 4, and then you go, right, we're going to remake 5 because they want to not kill off Wesker. And that's the purpose. It's just going to be very crushingly disappointing.
Going back to remake 4 and how different it could potentially be, you need to obviously factor into the count that they're bypassing Code Veronica. For anyone who's come into the series and has only played remakes, then Wesker's reintroduction in 4 is going to be extremely jarring. So I'm wondering if Wesker's going to play more of a hands-on role in the game, and his sort of confrontation that he had with Chris in Code Veronica is potentially going to factor in Remake 4, albeit it'll obviously be with Leon instead of Chris. Similar way they've tried to loosely reference the events of Gun Survivor by having the Tyrant Lab in Raccoon City. Maybe they're going to do more with Wesker in Resident Evil 4 to make up for bypassing a remake of Code Veronica.
This conversation literally hurts me.
I sympathise and I understand. There's also the other side of things. You say, when is it going to end? But it also means that time and effort and dedication is being spent on stuff and storylines that we've had already. That's annoying.
But that's also the reason why, Nick, you'll never see Capcom actively dismiss them. They're never ever going to come out and say Remake 2 and 3 aren't canon and invalidate them after the amount of money and effort spent promoting them.
And as I said earlier, you potentially alien audience who like them too. So, like if they really like them and they all of a sudden you say, well, those things, the reverse is true. We are the people that go, we like the OG and we like the OG story, and other people are like, we like the new ones. And if you say to one side or the other that they're not canon, you potentially frustrate it or make people feel like they wasted their time. I mean, I'm going to ask you guys, what is the point at which the line is crossed where you go, I've had enough, and this is probably the end of my interest in this franchise? Because listening to this whole conversation, I've asked that question to myself. I don't know what to say.
Years ago, Rob, we always used to joke that the moment Alice becomes confirmed character of the latest Resident Evil game would be that moment. To be honest, I think people have threatened that so many times over the years. I can't do it personally. I obviously got broken earlier this year after Remake 3 turned out to be a huge disappointment. Then we got the leak that Remake 4 was on the way. I was just like, I'm fucking done. I just need a break. I need a break. And I went like completely mental. I had like a 2-month break from Discord, didn't even go on it. I removed every Resident Evil reference on my Twitter account, refused to retweet or like anything Resident Evil because I just felt like I needed a break from the brand. And so, I think we've all had moments where we've had challenging times with the series. I don't think there's a single Resident Evil fan that lives today that hasn't had a moment where they've been like, I'm fucking done with it. I think from my personal point of view, there's too much love there. There's too much admiration for the times when it's been fantastic. And I will not mix my words up here that this series has given me my favourite video game experiences of my entire life. And that's not something you can easily just walk away from. These characters, it's a hilarious thing to say, but I love some of these characters more than I love some of my blood relatives. And I mean that wholeheartedly. It's ridiculous, but it's a part of me now. In answer to your question, Rob, I can't answer that because I don't know. The day that the classic canon is 100% put to death, like if we had a quote tomorrow from Capcom that said, sorry guys, original Resident Evil 1, 2 and 3 are no longer declared canon, nor is original 4. And as much as I think original 4 could be improved in so many ways, I think it has to stay because it's worth learning from your mistakes in terms of story, not talking about the game, in terms of story. You have to have your down points to improve. We would not have had the great stuff we had in 5 with all like the connective tissue to 0 and all that if we had not had 4 prior to that. You have to live by your mistakes, you have to learn from them, and I think the original timeline is that. If Capcom turned around and said, I'm sorry, the original timeline is now invalid, that would be a real hard hurdle for me to jump over, I'm afraid.
Let's hope then that my concluding point in the video that we did is totally wrong, because that's sadly my prediction was that might happen because of the benefit of being able to play it. I know, well, that's the point. As I said, in theory, PS5, come the release of Village, you will be able to play the entire storyline on one console. John, you'll probably say quite rightly, well, that doesn't mean it's a question over canon and continuity, isn't it? So it's there, but if my prediction was right, then that could cause some issues.
To quickly answer your question, Rob, bring Wesker back. That's enough for me to tell Capcom to shove it up their ass.
and I'm there as well, believe me, I am.
Okay. The final kind of little subtopic, if you like, on canon I want to quickly talk about is where we go from here. If these remakes exist and there's a bit more flexibility, if you like, in the minutiae of what is and what isn't canon, does that mean that headcanon takes more of a role in terms of storyline, which I think we would all advocate. If you don't like a particular game, I push other games I like. I consider things like Gaiden as in my canon timeline and no one can tell me otherwise. It's becoming more difficult to say, for example, if someone were to tweet or post a comment going, this is what happened, it's then near impossible for someone to say that's not true, because what is true and what isn't is becoming very blurred.
I think we just have to appreciate that everyone's got different opinions and, we all have different tastes, and we shouldn't get hung up over things like, does Wayne Lee exist in canon? Because fundamentally that doesn't matter. You might think he doesn't, Nick, I might think he does. It doesn't make any difference in terms of the story going forward. It goes back to your point earlier of, do we overanalyze the tiny things too much? Yes, we do. And I think we've all got to embrace headcanon a little bit more. You know, everyone's got their own ideas of things that's happened, and I think we've just got to sort of learn that despite this whole conversation tonight, the whole point of canon doesn't really matter. Does that make sense?
It does, and as someone who knows quite a lot about the Star Wars canon, people get very hung up about that as well. And Story Group, who are a little group who manage the storyline, they make it very clear that they're not there to tell people what's canon, what isn't. They just give little pointers to the authors or the storytellers. They have complete and free rein as to what they want to do. People interview the authors of said book. That one of the first questions, was there something you couldn't do? Did Story Group tell you off or anything like that? And they're like, no, and it's not like that because they don't want to give those restrictions in place. And so that harkens right back to Remake 2. If they wanted to actually do a Remake 2 and totally remake it, but still fit it in with the existing Prime Outbreak canon, they would have been so hampered by that, the game would have been almost to an extent pointless to remake. I'm not sure did you have any final thoughts, Sean, about kind of head canon and, personal stances and things like that?
The problem is this community, without going into any specifics, has too many pockets, too many bubbles of so many people thinking that their way is the right way. And unfortunately, we exist in a community where you can't really put forward a headcanon without some very, very almost venomous responses to it sometimes. There's not really so much of a middle ground in this. It's a hard one. It's really tough. I mean, I have my hard stance. It works for me, but I appreciate it doesn't work for everyone. We've seen on our Discord alone, there's so many newcomers to this series as a result of these games. And I don't want to gatekeep this franchise at all. It's not fair to, and it's not the right thing to do. I hate gatekeeping as a rule. And so we should welcome these people that are coming into the series from 2 and 3. And to them, that's the canon. And I have to accept that. I have to respect that. It's a really difficult question. That's an ever-moving goalpost, that is. And I honestly, at this present time of recording, I don't know how to answer it.
Rob, any thoughts on that?
I think it's the same thing. As I said earlier, the franchise is so many things to so many people, and I think we have to accept that when you remake games and also when you continue the franchise, especially if it's been around for almost 25 years, not everything is going to line up. It doesn't mean we can't be disappointed that things weren't done differently or better in our own eyes, but I think we just have to take forward the idea that things sometimes won't match, sometimes they will, and that maybe just it is going to be those baseline things that are the most important parts, and that when we get those things that line up, those little special events, as I've mentioned, like when HCF was mentioned in Resident Evil 7, and you just for a certain group or a certain person, those are, for lack of a better term, the wins. Those are the bits that we enjoy. And for someone also like John, who's put to like a continuity and timeline, that doesn't invalidate he's put that effort in and that exists. People can go and see what the lore will be, or that there's bits of information and lore that expand the game. So if you're interested in those things, if you want to learn a particular character or a timeline or how a virus was created, that information is out there, and it doesn't make it invalid just because it's not. Either it did exist at one point or it could still exist. And so for that sorts of information, that's really cool. If you want a deep dive, it's there. But also for people who don't want that and just want to play the games, they enjoy them for what they are. And I think that's cool. It's much like Sean just said, I don't want to see gatekeeping. I don't want to see that this particular thing's right and this particular thing's wrong. I think it's great to have healthy debate about the continuity and sit here and try and lament what could have been or what should be. But it's still a game series at the end of the day, and we should just enjoy what it is and the fun and excitement that we have. That said, if they bring back Wesker, I might be with you guys.
I would just echo what Rob's just said. I don't think I can put it any better. I think, we do get hung up on aspects of canon, and it's becoming a bit of a poisonous notion, the whole canon thing, and I honestly regret how I used to be in years gone by in terms of saying, well, no, this is canon, and this isn't. I think we all need to take a step back and just appreciate that everyone's got different tastes, different opinions. We can all look at the same evidence and come out with different conclusions, and I think we just need to, as a community, we just need to try and embrace that a bit more. These remakes, I enjoy the hell out of them in terms of gameplay. I think they're both very enjoyable Resident Evil games. I appreciate a lot of the added lore they've put in, but at the same time there's added lore I don't like. I was against the remakes going in, but, I appreciate that they're there. They give me an alternate route through Raccoon City, and I think maybe Remake 4 is a step too far. I don't really think that is needed. But overall, these two games, like them or loathe them, it's made us all realise that the concept of canon is something we take too seriously, and I think we should all just take a step back and just be a bit more liberal towards it in future. I just think it's a stupid thing to fall out about.
For the past 8 years and 5 seasons, we have brought you groundbreaking lore, in-depth analysis, game reviews, and high-quality content. We've also brought you untold controversies, and countless tales of underhand tactics, all in aid of the quiz.
I'd just like to announce, everybody, that this is 0 points for me this week. Thank you. Goodbye.
So my nomination person said 7, but I didn't agree with 7. I said it was 7T, and then you said it was 7T.
I didn't want people to think I'm cheating by just saying the same number that someone else has said, so I just the next number that sounds similar to 17. I swear I did not cheat, yo!
Jesus Christ. What kind of fucking question is that?
Quite frankly, if we only got 1 point and that's the winning score, then we're not doing our jobs right, and we're all going to have to hand in our biohazard cards.
Welcome to Neptune's Biohazard Quiz. Batman. Star Tyrants. George Trevor. Robbie McGregor. Mr. Spencer. Neptune's Biohazard Quiz.
Welcome one and all, we're back, it's Neptune's Biohazard Quiz. John, welcome back, are you prepared?
I'm a bit nervous.
It looks like my 2 victories since you've been gone are going to be soundly ended tonight.
Interesting George isn't here, because he's been making some complaints about the quiz, so we've had to address some of those issues. So
it's not like him.
So we all know the rules. We've got 5 brand new questions. So clear your desktop so you can open up Notepad. Let's go. So question number 1 comes in from our patron, Kane Harvey. As a reminder, all our patrons get the ability to send me questions and guaranteed acceptance. So he's come up with this stonker of a question. Toy Uncle is full of references to other Capcom IPs. Monster Hunter is represented as what fictional game? There we go. Good question there. Thank you, Kane. Question number 2. In Resident Evil from 1996, what does it say on the herbicide packet? So you can examine it. Question number 3. This just made me laugh. What are the names of the Kite Brothers? Yes, we've spoken about the Kite Brothers very briefly this evening. Bonus points for funny names. If you know the answers, you know what I mean. Anyway, question number 4. So because George complained, and it's conspicuous by his absence, we've had a question from Vito. When was the suicide note in Remake dated?
Fucking hell.
I have to admit that is a good question, though.
It is a good question, yeah. He wanted to make you suffer. Not you personally, Rob, but...
Well, maybe. I don't know.
I can't imagine Vito would be like that. But yes, good question from Vito there. And finally, because it's nearly Christmas and I wanted one about myself. Question number 5. What strain of the T-virus was the wonderful Neptune injected with? There we go. There are the 5 questions. Join us after this one. We'll run through those answers.
Now, arriving at Nest.
Hello! Hi! Welcome! Hello! Hi! Welcome, Mr. Taylor! Welcome to Nest! What a pleasant surprise! We were not expecting you.
Yes, hello, Dr. Lee. I am grateful for your attendance. Less so Dr. Birkin, who I was expecting.
Dr. Birkin is busy at the moment. I thought you found this okay?
No, not really as it happens. I had to wade through the city sewer system, play a game of chess, and then descend a cable car. It's almost like Umbrella are trying to hide this place.
Oh, nonsense. We just deal with dangerous chemicals to keep the public safe. Nothing to hide. We welcome visits even if they are unannounced.
Welcome to Nest. Enjoy your visit.
See? Bracelet buddies.
Right. Well, now I am here. I am eager to get to work.
Remind me, Miss Taylor, which department do you work for?
Dr. Lee, I am project manager within Human Resources. It is my job to report on the health and welfare of our staff and then feed this back to the local and federal bodies. I need to know that we are engaging in safe practices across the country. I have to be honest, had it not been a wayward comment, I never would have known this place existed. As soon as I learnt of it, I authorized an immediate on-site inspection.
Quite right. A business is life itself. So important to be thorough. Can I ask what you have been told we produce at this facility?
An odd question, Dr. Lee, but very well, yes. I note here that Nest is where Umbrella produces its supply of cotton candy.
That's right. Yes, the world's best cotton candy, produced here in Nest.
Oh, so can I see the production line?
I am so sorry, Miss Taylor. That is absolutely impossible.
Why?
Well, for a start, we handle extremely dangerous chemicals here that, if exposed to human skin, can cause complications.
For cotton candy?
That's right. For very dangerous stuff. But thankfully, we are all very well protected with the clear safety measures.
Well, this is what I would like to see. These measures in action. I would like to see the staff enacting policies that have seemingly not come from my office.
This is the second issue. The cotton candy is not actually produced here at the Nest. As far as I know.
As far as you know? This is your laboratory. You must know what you produce.
Well, HQ keep changing their minds. And actual production of the cotton candy is done at the underground lab, out in the city outskirts. That is where Dr. Birkin is positioned.
I am sorry, this is very confusing. Dr. Birkin works here?
Yes, that is right.
But you just said he has another lab producing cotton candy?
Yes, that's right.
I would have thought that the higher-ups would have clarified this by now.
Yes, you would have thought so.
So, moving on then. Will I be able to... What in the world was that?
What was what?
That scream, it sounded like a child. Are there children on site?
Oh yes. We have hundreds of children here. They are extremely helpful with research. I mean testing. Yes, I mean testing, of course. How silly of me. The testing of the cotton candy. The chief brings them all here from the orphanage. And they have an absolutely lovely time.
That did not sound like a nice time.
Oh, no. That is just the sound of excitement from all of the new flavors. It happens all the time. It is all okay.
Well, I wouldn't mind seeing these kids to make sure they are okay.
Of course, absolutely. But unfortunately, they have already left, I would imagine. You would probably bump into the subjects, children, in the sewers.
I have to say, Dr. Lee, I'm not happy here. Standard health and safety procedures are not being followed. I'm unable to see production line, and now I hear children screaming. I'm going to have to log this in my report. At the very least, will I be able to get a free sample?
A sample? Do you have any idea the hours and the work that has gone on here just to hand over a sample of the generic flavored cotton candy?
Okay, what do I need to obtain a sample?
Do you have any children?
For the love of...
welcome back. Here we go. Question number 1 was from Kane. So, Toy Uncle is full of references to other Capcom IPs. Monster Hunter is represented by which fictional game? We're going to start with you, Batman.
I haven't got a clue. I'm sorry.
Haven't got a clue. Okay.
I've not got a clue.
Stars Tarrant.
I could not recall anything either, rather regrettably.
Romby.
I actually know this one. Monster Shooter.
Is correct. It is Monster Shooter. Very good. Good question from Kane, because everyone obviously picks up on the Mega Man reference in Toy Uncle, but less so the Monster Hunter one. So yes, Monster Shooter. Very good. So points on the board for Romby there. Question number 2 was, what does it say on the herbicide packet in the 1996 Resident Evil game? Stars Tarrant.
I used to know it, but it's not coming to me. I apologise. I have to pass on this one too.
Any guess?
No. I have no idea.
Okay, we'll go back to Rob. Did you know this one?
Earth.
Earth, okay. Batman?
I didn't know. Earth sounds familiar, but I actually said pesticide.
Put pesticide. It's another point to Rob. It is Earth. Very good, sir. Very good. Question number 3. What are the names of the Kite brothers? We'll start with Romby this time.
I have no idea. This is the one I'm like, meh, can't remember. No idea.
I don't know where it's from. Specifically, I assume it's the file. Batman, I expect you to know this one.
It's Oral and Werner Kite.
Okay, Sean?
I can safely say I did not have that as my answer.
It is Oral. When I wrote it, I said Oral, which I found quite amusing, but that's because I'm a child. But there we go. Oral and Werner Kite is correct, so points on the board to Batman. Well done. Question number 4 was, what was the date of the suicide note in Remake? Batman.
June 22nd, 1998.
June 22nd, 1998. Okay. Romby.
I'd said June 1998, but I said June 20th.
June 20th. Okay. Stars Tarrant.
I had no idea, but I'm going to give my answer as June 22nd. No, I'm not. I have fucking no idea. No idea at all. I'm going for a 0 this week. Thank you.
It is a full point to John there. It is the 22nd of June in 1998. Rob, I'm going to give you half for getting June 1998. That's 2/3 of it. Because in theory that could have been at any point from May, so you did well, so you're going to get half a point there. Well done. And finally, question number 5. What strain of the T-virus was Neptune injected with? Batman.
I believe it's the alpha strain T-virus.
The alpha strain, okay. Stars Tarrant.
I just guessed Epsilon because I honestly don't know enough about the previous strains anymore. It's gone from my brain.
The Epsilon strain, okay. That's definitely a strain. Romby.
I had no idea. I was just like...
It is a point to Batman. It is the alpha strain of the T-virus.
That's not in the game, though, is it?
No, it's not in the game. In the guidebook.
Fucking guidebook.
Oh, that explains it.
No.
Is alpha like an early... Is it like a primitive or precursor? Or I don't even know. I can't even remember.
It's the first version of the T-virus, isn't it?
There's a few strains. There's obviously the Marcus strain, the Birkin prototype strain with Ebola, the Alpha strain, the Beta 1 strain, the Beta 2 strain, etc., all the way up to the Epsilon strain, which is the one used in the Mansion incident.
Oh, well, there we go. So that is the 5 questions. So let's have a look at those. Oh! What's that noise? Oh, yes!
No.
Oh, yes! We've been...
God.
Could you tell from his voice he's been waiting a whole fucking podcast to do that, hasn't he?
Oh, God.
It's like the delivery of the 4K 6 movie box set has just come through the door.
He's like, yes, I know what I'm doing with my... Yeah.
We've been doing a canon podcast, so it is only fitting for non-canon corner to make its triumphant return.
Is it really?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. The powers that be have decided that absolutely it is spot on, and I can reveal that non-canon corner is worth 3 points. So
go on, you've got a chance.
You've got a chance to draw.
Fucking hell.
So listen very carefully. Just the one question in non-canon corner this time. In what non-canon media project can you play as Orissa Gleans, Ridley Siberia, Tony Glanz, and Susan Loth? We're going to start with Batman.
This is a guess, and only because those names are so ridiculous. I remember Biohazard 7 was it Walk Through the Fear, which was that VR thing that the Selfish Gene played. And I remember seeing photographs of the character cards and the names. I can't remember any of the names, but the names were utterly ridiculous. So I'm going to guess it's Biohazard Walk Through the Fear.
Okay, Romby?
Yeah, I was going to go with Valiant Raid, the VR. No idea, so I'm just going to say that. I'm taking they're ridiculous names.
Valiant Raid, okay. Stars Tyrant, what was your answer?
I had no idea, so I just went for iSurvivor.
Well, you know I do like to revert to iSurvivor when possible. One of you is correct. It's Batman, it is Biohazard 7 Walk Through the Fear. So, congratulations, Master of Canon and Non-Canon, it seems.
Non-Canon King.
A non-canon king, there we go.
All canon king.
All canon king, absolutely. It's all canon. It's all canon. So let's have a look at those final scores. So this week's winner with a whopping 6 points. It's Batman. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you.
In second place, with a respectable 2.5, it's Romby.
It's a good outcome.
And Stars Tyrant, sadly, it is a massive 0 out of 5.
Thank
6,
you.
9. No. I can't count. 8, really. It's 0 out of 8.
Our Quizmaster, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah. Anyway, nice bit of fun to end the Canon podcast. So join us next time where we'll have some more questions. There we go, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much. That does finish our canon discussion concerning Remake 2, Remake 3, and everything else in between. It's been great to have John back as well to discuss and bring his expertise to the fold. I suppose hopefully we'll get some clarification from Capcom in the future, but then, based on what we've discussed tonight, perhaps we don't. Perhaps ignorance is best and we just live in a different world where it just doesn't matter. We'll see how it goes. So I think there's a lot riding on Village just to see what it references, if anything at all, and any kind of supplemental material that comes out.
If you've listened to this, feel free to jump on the Discord and have a conversation about it with us, because in between each other, because I think this is an interesting thing that everyone can get involved in, what they think about the canon and what they would like to see in a respectful and very straightforward manner. You know, like it's obviously very people that are especially very interested in the series, and I'm kind of interested in what everyone else is thinking too. You know, we've gone with this conversation.
Well, absolutely, and we're not in any way advocating what we say is right, because we all have different opinions within our little group anyway. So it makes, there's no right or wrong answer. Sean is, I say hardball. That's harsh, but you know what I mean. It's OGs. I like to perhaps try and use some of the files, but that's getting me in muddles and headaches, and I don't know. It's all very much up in the air, isn't it? So yeah, absolutely get involved. You can find links to our Discord on our website or our main Twitter page if you want to come and join along. That will be it for this year. We will be back in the new year when, rather appropriately, we're going to be having a nice retrospective discussion on Resident Evil 4. Yeah, we've noted that for such a huge game in the series, we haven't covered it as much as perhaps we'd like. So we're all going to, dig out our copies of Resident Evil 4. It's just such a shame. It's only on one console. Getting hold of Resident Evil 4 is so hard. It's
How would I know you're going to say that?
Well, I'm afraid, through our friendship, Rob, my lines are so predictable nowadays. Yeah, we're all going to dust out some Resident Evil 4 and have a nice retrospective discussion on the game generally, its standing in the series, the impacts it's had, how well it plays now, especially after Remake, which I think refined the over-the-shoulder controls quite well. How does that play going back, playing basically tank controls with over-the-shoulder camera and things like that, and Separate Ways, Assignment Ada, the Wesker lineage and importance, all those things. We're going to have a nice look back now that the game is rumoured to have a remake, and well, it's creeping up to its 20th anniversary, I suppose, in the next 4 years or so. So that's to look forward to in the new year. So I'd like to take this opportunity as well to thank everyone for their ongoing support and wish everyone a happy Christmas. Especially, it's 2020. It's not been the best year. It's been difficult for so many people. So if everyone can please keep safe, the world's nearly through it, and hopefully when we start 2021, there'll be light at the end of the tunnel. We can all get back to living a bit more normally going forward. So, but Merry Christmas, everyone. Happy New Year. It's goodbye from me, Neptune.
Goodbye from me, Batman.
Goodbye from me, Stars Tyrant.
And goodbye from me, Robbie.
What's the deal with canon?
It's all canon.